Folks, welcome back. This is technically your Friday because you've got this unique week since tomorrow is, as they like to say, Valentine's Day with an M, right? We're just going to with an M. Valentine's. I'm kidding. Valentine's Day is tomorrow, so we don't have class tomorrow evening. So I didn't want any of you getting divorces or separations or being disowned or anything. So we do have class tonight, but no class tomorrow, but we make up for it at the end of the cycle. And so we've got a lot of you, but not quite everybody yet. So tonight is going to be a fun-filled night of learning. This is where we start getting into the big boy and girl chapters, okay? Everything I've taught you thus far, you may have liked some of it, you may have not liked some of it, you may have been confused by some of it, but honestly, the stuff that we've gone over thus far is the moderately to low testable area. You will absolutely see questions on them, but it is not a crazy amount of questions. But it is still important to build a foundational knowledge on the real estate concepts in general to help you understand anything you could see on the test. And so today is when we get into the really in-depth testable topics. Okay, we've got a few small topics to get through, and then we'll wrap up the night getting into agency. Agency is the doozy chapter. So that is what is going to happen. Let me put my screen up here. The slide we left off on. And as per usual, I'll give you just a moment. If there's anything that you need to ask me that you're confused about, you don't know what's going on or anything like that, with anything in particular, I will answer it. Otherwise, we'll kick off this fun-filled night. Everybody feeling good? Ish, kinda, sorta. Cool. Then let's good enough, right, Jacob? As good as one can be. I hear you. There we go. So, last night we basically wrapped up the transfer of title and deeds section, and we kind of went off on a little bit of a tangent. I started teaching you excise tax, which is also called revenue stamps or transfer tax. It is a tax that you pay when you sell real property. And so it is paid to the state of North Carolina for us, and it is $1 for every $500 worth of purchase price. And this is where I started warning you about certain topics being very confusing, because when we start giving you test questions that contain purchase price, loan amount, assessed value, appraised value, all these different values, you're going to have to know which value to use for which different mathematical scenario. And so remember, excise tax, definitely don't mix it up with real property taxes. Excuse me, because that'll mess you up as well. So the other special thing about excise tax, now folks, this is very important. Remember I told you, when you calculate excise tax, you take the purchase price and you divide it by 500, and that's your excise tax. However, we do not like change. And when I say we, the state, they will not accept change. It doesn't matter if it's 1 penny or 99 pennies, you round up to the next dollar, okay? Round up. You never round down on excise tax. And I promise you, the unrounded answer will be an answer choice on these. It sure will. I don't know what is going on. And I'm just all of a sudden got the big yawns in me. So, everybody feeling okay on excise tax? Hopefully not too bad. So, last things in this section, before we move on to bigger and better stuff, is just clarifying the difference between settlement and closing. There's a lot of terminologies that I've already started using, and I have to be cautious because some of them you don't know very in depth yet. And I'll give you an example before I get to this one. Yesterday, I started giving you some insight into the settlement statement, is what I kept calling it, the settlement statement. But I also used the term closing disclosure. Now, technically, those are the same thing, but there is a slight nuance that I'll teach you later. But when we get to settlement versus closing, this is one of those things where people use them interchangeably, but they're not actually interchangeable. So when I say settlement, that is what we call the meeting, where all parties go to sign the documents that they need to in order for the closing to happen. So when you buy a house, there are certain documents, the loan documents and otherwise, that you would sign as the buyer. And then there are certain documents that you would sign as the seller. Well, this is the weirdest yawns I've ever had in my life. I don't even feel tired, but they just keep coming out of nowhere. And so the seller, you're signing the deed for transfer and things of that nature. And so the settlement is the meeting where people go to sign their respective documents. Closing, the way that we look at closing is when it's actually closed. And that doesn't actually occur until the deed has been recorded. I told you, even though it's not necessary for the deed to be recorded for it to be valid, it does get recorded in the real world, because why would you not protect your interest? Of course you would. So we always record them in a real estate transaction, and we don't consider it closed until the deed has been recorded. So settlement is the meeting, closing is actual recordation of the deed. Now, just one other, kind of note here, and I don't think it's going to be too crazy. I told you, when we're dealing with the settlement meeting in North Carolina, our settlements are handled by attorneys. We are a title theory state, and we are an attorney state, meaning that those title searches are done by attorneys, the signing of the documents is handled at an attorney's office, and then ultimately they're the ones recording the new deed in the name of the new grantee. And so we call those attorney-style closings or attorney settlement meetings. Then we have those other states that I told you do not use attorneys, they use title companies, and that's what's called an escrow-style closing. Think of it more like a mail-away closing. Everybody gets their documents sent to them, they fill them out in front of a notary, and then they send them back. And so once upon a time in our attorney state, we would actually we used to all sit at the table together, and we would just pass it around, seller, seller, buyer, buyer, and we'd sign multiple copies of each document. Now we've kind of done away with doing that at this point, but I would get some coffee on this next break, on this first break. This is crazy. I've never in my life have I just been so just rolling, and I just keep having these just super deep yawns that I can't control.
Currently what I'm doing is making coffee while I listen.
There you go, right? That's I'm gonna need some too. I apparently didn't have enough today because I am not in control of these yawns. I don't know what's happening here. And now I'm thinking about it. Just saying the word in my head is making me do it more. So that's just a struggle. So I'm just trying to focus on not saying it. So let me give you one other thing before we move on to the next section, okay? Let me give you some test taking tips, because as I told you back on the first week, this is probably 60% material and repetition and understanding. But then I would say that almost 40% is going to be some level of test-taking prowess. And this is where, you just got to be careful. And I think I've already used this with y'all, folks. If I was to tell you, to tell me what 2 + 2 is, you would all say 4. But you have to understand that no matter how much you think you know that the answer is 4, don't look for the right answer. That is a terrible way to screw up your test. And so time you get a question, there's a few different strategies that I want you to be aware of. Because remember, all of your test questions are multiple choice. So first, let me introduce with what's called a Boolean style question. Okay, a Boolean style question is just a very weird way of saying every answer has one of 2 possible values. And so if you got a question like this, essential elements of a valid deed exclude all of the following except. And so what this means is 3 of these things are true, and one of these things is not true or false, and you are looking for the outlier. Anytime you see these kind of questions, you're looking for that one thing that's not like the other. That would be the same style of question if you were looking for which of the following would be a true statement questions. If you get one of those, right, which of the following would be a true statement, you're looking for 3 things that are false, and there's going to be one thing that's true. This is just called a Boolean style of question. No, you do not need to know that word. That's just what it is, because every answer choice has one of 2 possible values only. And the beauty of that is you can use that information to help you answer a question, even if you may not know what the answer is. And so all of the essential elements of a valid deed include all of the following except. So that means there's 3 things that are necessary for the deed to be valid and 1 thing that is not. Okay, 1 thing that is not. And so if you look right here and you see this word acknowledgement, you're like, wait a second, I don't even remember what that means. Well, that's okay, let's move on. Writing, oh yeah, no, it does have to be in writing. Competent grantor, yeah, 18 sane and sober, that's true. Execution, now in this context, execution means to sign. We'll talk more about the word execution in the contract section. So if you at least know that writing, legal capacity of the grantor, and signature of the grantor are essential elements, even if you don't know what that word acknowledgement means, that can help you identify that that's the answer. Does everybody understand what I'm saying here? Because you can use this methodology to identify. You don't necessarily have to know the answer. You just have to sometimes be able to figure out what it's not. And so this one's true, this one's true, this one's true. And so anytime you get one of these Boolean style questions, it's looking for the one thing that's not like the other. Now, I will tell you that I've heard from the Real Estate Commission, and I don't know how true this is with the new testing provider coming out, that they have really made a valiant effort to try to remove these negative words or any kind of things that would cause you to make silly mistakes, because boy, do people make silly mistakes when this word accept is thrown in there. Sometimes they miss it. And so I think that they've kind of done away with these on the test. I'm not going to swear to you that they're gone, but just because you won't see a negative does not mean you won't see a Boolean style question, because you will see, especially on my test, which of the following would be a true statement, which is easier for your brain to comprehend because it's not a negative, it's a positive. But it's the same style of question. So this is just talking about test taking strategy. Just giving you a little insight here. I told you acknowledgement is just a fancy word for notarized. And it does have to be notarized in order to be recorded, but neither of those are required for the deed to be valid. Now, yet again, be careful with the verbiage here. When we're dealing with this, and of course it'll never be this ambiguous on the test, we will kind of give you a little more insight into the questions. And so let me break this into 2 questions. This says true or false, to be valid and enforceable, a deed must be recorded. Okay, well, let's just start with the valid piece. Does a deed need to be recorded to be valid? No. But does it need to be recorded to be effective against third parties or enforceable against third parties? Once again, yes.
Yes.
There you go. So this is true in this very vague context that we've given you. Of course, there are situations where if we're talking about between the parties, a deed that's in writing is enforceable between the 2 parties to it. But if we're talking about enforceable against third party interest, that kind of changes things with that recordation. So this is just a recap, not a super in-depth test question. Now the second one says this type of deed implies the grantor has ownership, but does not warranty anything about the property. No guarantees, no promises, no nothing, but does suggest they own it. Which type of deed was that?
Bargain and sale.
There it is. Bargain and sale deed. Yeah, I own it. I don't know anything else. And I'm giving it to you. Which is different than a quitclaim deed, right? Because it's like, I don't even know if I own it or not. But if I do own anything, I'm giving it to you. So the bargain and sale deed is the second lowest next to that quitclaim deed. But remember, they all do technically convey ownership. How about this one? Bobby Buyer recently purchased a home for $260,000 from Susanna. In the process, he obtained a conventional loan from BB&T for $200,000. How much was the excise tax paid at closing, and who paid it?
520. It's
Fi-
by Suzanne.
There you go. There you go. Folks, 520, and it's paid by Susanna the seller. Remember, there's a default for everything. And so all you do, because this is one of those scenarios where I told you, you've got more than one number and you've got to remember which number you use. Well, excise tax is always based off of purchase price. So it was purchased for 260. The loan amount is irrelevant. 260 divided by the 500, $520. And without saying to the contrary, it always defaults to a seller. And if the seller is having to pay it on the settlement statement, what did we call that yesterday? Debit. There you go. When we're dealing with a settlement statement, a debit is when we're taking money from you, and a credit is when we're giving money to you. That's it. How about this one? True or false, person signs a deed conveying property to their best friend. They place the deed in a safe deposit box and do not tell anyone of the transfer. Upon this person's death, the best friend receives ownership of the property. Is that true or false?
False.
False. Why? What is it lacking?
Because he has to give it to the recipient.
Delivery and acceptance by the grantee. It was never actually delivered. It was never voluntarily accepted. Nobody was made aware of it. And so it was not a valid deed. That's exactly right. How about this one? Deed recordation is necessary to protect the title against which one? I like it, Eliza. Just
C.
That's an easier to answer, right? Hold on. The other letters are harder. C is easy enough, right? You can do C, but like once you start getting into like A, is that nope. How do you? I can't do it. There you go. There's an A. How do you? It's C, folks. Because if somebody transfers title to you and they know it and you know it, but the rest of the world doesn't, couldn't the seller still pretend like they own it and try to defraud people? Because if you look in the public record, they would still potentially be the owner of record. So you record it to protect yourself from the previous owner and anybody else who's going to try to claim that they own it. So, just a couple pieces of verbiage here. Connor Act. Folks, remind me what the Connor Act was. What was it about? What was it in regard to? What needed to happen?
And a counter offer?
Not a counter offer.
Recording?
Recording. The Connor Act is a piece of legislation that says certain things need to be recorded in order to protect your interest from other people who may try to, bypass that interest or whatever. General warranty deed. Remember, all deeds transfer ownership, but that one has the most warranties. It's like the bumper to bumper. It's the extended warranty because I have that covenant of season, covenant against encumbrances, covenant of further insurance forever. All these different covenants that say, yes, it's good title. Yes, I'm conveying it to you. Yes, you have the right to convey it. If there's ever an issue, I will come back and fix it forever and ever. Amen. Grantor is the person who deeds ownership over. Grantee is the person who receives that ownership on the deed. What was adverse possession?
To take ownership of another person's property after extending use.
There you go. Adverse possession was a type of involuntary alienation where you try to steal somebody else's property. Do not confuse that with an easement by prescription, which is just use of somebody else's property. Cloud on title is when there's some type of title defect. It typically needs to be resolved before we can convey it using that suit to quiet title. And of course, a grantee is the person who receives the property on a deed. Which leads us into the next fun-filled section. Now here's the deal. I always like to give you a little bit of insight as to what we're getting to talk about. We're not to agency yet. I told you there's a couple smaller sections before we get there. This, yet again, is important. It is testable. It is not a crazy number of questions. When we get down to it, historically, I mean, I've got to delve into it some more as the test is changing, but historically, contracts, financing, agency, those are your big ticket. North Carolina license on commission rules, those are your big ticket items for testing. But all of these have a smattering. So this one is getting into land use controls. Remember on day 1, 2, somewhere around there, I asked you, if you own a house right now, can you do whatever you want with it? And the answer was no. And the reason is public and private land use controls. When I say public land use controls, I want you to think about things that affect an entire city, county, town. When I say private land use controls, I want you to think about private property owners. Okay? Private land use controls are imposed by people who previously owned the property. Public land use controls are imposed by the government. That's the big difference. Public land use controls is government, private land use controls is private property owners. So we got to make sure that we go over the difference, to make sure that you understand some of the big testable ramifications herein. And so that way, you know, you kind of know what to expect for these types of questions on the test. Of course, these are just there for you to see these learning objectives, but they are, they're pretty straightforward. We're going to hit on all of them. So here is the public and the private land use controls outline, okay? And I'm going to say it again. Public land use controls are government. Private land use controls are not. I want you to think back to the first week. Dora is not allowed to put her own style of fence up because she has restrictive covenants that say she can't. Well, I want you to think about who put those restrictive covenants on that property. Who was it?
The HOA.
The HOA, but then we're kind of dealing with the chicken versus the egg and which came first. I want you to think about properties that are developed. HOAs don't just magically appear.
The developer.
The developer. So if you think about a standard subdivision, here's what happens. Somebody called a developer, which is a real estate profession, right? It is in the business of real estate. They will go out and they'll buy a large parcel of land and they will develop it. Now, development could be a subdivision, development could be new construction, development could be an amusement park, but they are basically turning raw land into something. And so let's say it's a subdivision. Well, folks, let me draw you a pretty picture here. They purchase 100 acres, 200 acres, 50, whatever it is. And they are currently the owners, the deeded owners, fee simple absolute owners, presumably. And so what they do is they then will have a plan drawn up and they'll create these cul-de-sacs, cut in the roads, draw up the maps, create the lots. But what they do to make their lives easy and to maintain the value of these properties, as opposed to having to record deed restrictions on all 300 lots, they just take this one giant piece of parcel when they own it and they create a list of rules called restrictive covenants. And they record that. Thank you, Jacob. That is a beautiful map, isn't it? I'm an artiste, okay? With a digital pen. So they will record a set of restrictive covenants. And they will say, here's the rules of what you can and can't do. And it is an appurtenance. And it is a what? What's the other word that we use that it is?
An encumbrance.
An encumbrance. Because they are limiting your future use of the property. And so the developer, who is the private land use controls, private property owner, creates a set of rules for every single one of these lots in one fell swoop. And it will say something like, being all of lots 1 through 320, here's your restrictive covenants, here's the rules you have to follow. Those are private land use controls. They're private because they only affect the people in this one neighborhood, and the person who imposed those rules was a private property owner. Folks, I promise you the government does not care if you have chickens in your backyard. If it doesn't violate their rules, they don't care. You cannot be arrested for having chickens because the government does not get involved in private. But private is still enforceable because these restrictive covenants are in writing per the statute of frauds and recorded per the Connor Act. Now, let me make sure you understand the distinction here. The homeowners association and restrictive covenants are not the same thing. Restrictive covenants is a set of rules that are written out by an attorney on behalf of the developer and then recorded as private land use controls. But very often, the developer will create a set of bylaws which outlines the creation of a homeowners association. And so if there is a homeowners association, the HOA, they are the governing body for the restrictive covenants. They can come and they can tell you what you have to adhere to. They can issue fines if you don't follow these rules. But please understand that even if you do not have a homeowners association, you may very well have private land use controls, and they may very well be enforceable. Hold on one second. My dog just came in here. Hold on one second.
This is the new puppers, right? What's his name again?
Charlie.
Come on, Charlie.
Charlie is a very hyperactive poodle mix.
We just snuck up the stairs.
So when he bites you, what do you say?
That's how he got his name. So he likes to nibble, and so the rescue that I took the other dog to, they had named him Charlie because he likes to nibble on people because he gets so excited, and so he is named after the little kids saying Charlie bit me, or whatever he says. So he just came in and just pushed my door open. I guess it wasn't closed all the way. So gotta love it.
The dog does that all the time, but my door automatically swings shut, so he'll walk in,
And be trapped.
push it open, and then he'll trap himself in. So I'll get home from work and he'll be so excited because he's been trapped in my room for God knows how long.
There you go. That's right. Yeah. So he's a good dog, but he's a little hyper. So private land use controls, okay, understand, as I was saying, your HOA is the enforcing body. But folks, if you have a neighborhood that's built after the 1990s, you probably have restrictive covenants. I mean, almost a guarantee in most areas, if it is a subdivision, you have restrictive covenants, even if you don't have an HOA. And as such, these are enforceable. Now, I want you to think about this. The government doesn't care whether or not you build that fence that you wanted to door. The government doesn't care whether or not you have chickens, even though the HOA or the restrictive covenants say you can't. But they can still be enforced, even if there's no HOA. I want you to think about it. Take a guess who might be able to enforce these private land use controls.
So you mean, okay, can you ask that question again? You said if it's not the government, who can enforce it?
Yeah, for these private land use controls, the government doesn't care. You cannot call the police and say, my neighbor has chickens and my restrictive covenants say they can't. The police is going to say, I don't care.
The HOA is the one that enforces it.
But if there is no HOA, they are still very much enforceable.
Is it the county, right?
Nope.
Or-
The county's the public.
The courthouse?
The courthouse is just a courthouse. You got to be more specific.
Would it just be the developer?
Now, the developer, they're typically hands off once they finish the development.
The property owner.
Which property owner? Your neighbors.
One has the issue.
Your neighbors. Folks, you're not going to force yourself to adhere to these rules. So let's say that we're all neighbors and our restrictive covenants say that we're not allowed to have chickens. And I have chickens. And Sandeep is my next door neighbor. Sandeep says, oh, hell no. I'm not dealing with that. He's got a rooster that crows every morning. It smells terrible. He can go and take me to court by way of an injunction and force me to follow the rules. Judge Judy will tell me to stop. So it is a civil thing between neighbors, but it is enforceable because it is recorded as an appurtenance and an encumbrance for rules set by that property. So you could be forced to adhere to these even if you don't have an HOA. That is one of the biggest misconceptions that sellers have. It's like, well, I don't have an HOA. Nobody tells me what to do. Yeah, they do, sweetness, if they got the time. Now, understand that they would have to go after everybody in the neighborhood. So let's say that I had chickens, Corey had chickens, Misty had chickens. Sandeep can't go after just me. He would have to go after everybody in the neighborhood that has chickens simultaneously. But these are private land use controls. It is between private landowners. Public is government. Now, of course, when we're dealing with both of them existing, the more strict rule prevails. So let me make one statement, then I'll answer your question, Josh. I told you that government doesn't care if you have chickens unless it violates their rules. So let me give you an example of this. I live in an area that is zoned, and we're going to talk about zoning in a second, in Johnston County called AR. Not the gun, stands for agricultural residential. And so it allows for livestock and miniature farms and things of that nature. So I can have chickens in my zoning under Johnston County rules. But my neighborhood has restrictive covenants to say, no chickens. And so the more strict rule prevails when we're looking at both of them. I can't supersede it just because Johnston County says I can have them. I got to adhere to my neighborhood's rules. Where'd you go, Josh? They are.
No, I'm right here. The question I have is kind of back to the restrictive covenants, because I kind of have like where my parents live. There's like this situation going on now where the HOA has been trying to enforce that people pay their HOA fees, but also still like abide by the restrictions and the rules and regulations, but they're having like difficulties doing so. So I guess in that situation, because there's like one person who, well, he's like the ex-pastor of our church because he had his own church. He runs it. Could he, or does it have to be like, would it have to just be him trying to enforce everything, or would it still be the HOA trying to enforce everything?
Is there an HOA?
He said that there is. Well, there is an HOA. There is an HOA.
If there is an HOA, then they should be the main person who goes after people. They should be the ones that are taking them to court. They should be the ones that are enforcing it. It doesn't necessarily mean that he can't enforce it separately, but understand that a homeowners association has more powers than a person because, and let me just put this out there, in North Carolina, we have the Planned Community Act, which basically gives additional powers to a homeowners association, which is why a lot of times they're created. So if you and I have disputes as neighbors, I can take you to court, and if I win, you can, be forced to follow the rules or be issued, fines or, things of that nature. But with an HOA, if you don't follow the rules, the HOA has the ability to issue fines. If you don't pay those fines, the HOA can put liens on your property. And if you don't pay those liens, the HOA can actually foreclose on your property.
Okay, because he did mention that what they've been doing is just assessing liens on people's properties, and they'll have to just resort to that once they move out.
Yeah, and so, most HOAs are not going to go through the legal hassle of foreclosing to get a couple $1,000s worth of fines, but they will have to be resolved whenever they go to sell because they are an encumbrance on the property that nobody will want to take title to it while it's on there. So they will need to be paid off at closing. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I'll circle back around to the private, but I wanted you to make sure that, you kind of understood this differentiation. So let's really dive into the public, okay? Public is government. And so when we're saying government, folks, that is actually law. It is the use of what we call police power. When we talked about eminent domain and that condemnation, we talked about police power. Police power use to protect the public's health, safety, and welfare. The reason why this kind of exists is because they've got to make sure that they maintain municipalities. And once again, that's a generic term for meaning your city, your township, your county. They maintain them so that it is a safe, desirable place for all persons to live. And so the Enabling Act gives the individual powers to the municipalities to handle their zoning and their ordinances. So understand that, yet again, this is very local in nature. This is not coming from the federal government on what the city of Raleigh has to do, or the city of Wilmington has to do, or Wake County versus Cumberland County has to do. Every single county has their own, commissioners and planning boards and members that make decisions on how the city and the county and all these places are going to operate. And so when I say public land use controls, it involves a lot of things. The planning board, the individual zoning, which is what we're going to talk about in a second, subdivision regulations and how they oversee them, building codes, and then, of course, environmental protection legislation. Now, environmental protection legislation exists on both the local, state, and federal levels. So sometimes we do have federal protections, like, of course, bald eagles. Folks, you can't do anything in a territory that's zoned for bald eagles that would cause any danger to them as the, nation's bird. So there are a lot of federal controls that sometimes bleed into it. But there's a lot of different pieces. And so let's start with planning. If you didn't realize this, every municipality utilizes what's called a master plan. The master plan is basically a very long-term plan for the municipality. What is our current road structure? What is our current population? What is our 10-year trend? What do we estimate our next 10-year trend to be? How many public schools do we need? How many libraries do we need? What kind of, money do we need from the Department of Transportation? Okay, it's called the master plan. And I want to give you an example of this. If you've ever driven through a city and you are just driving along and you're like, oh my God, this is the cutest city I've ever seen in my life. That is exactly where I would have put that. These traffic lights flow so smooth. Everything is just great in this area. That is a city that either had a fantastic planning board or they had very gradual growth and they could handle it and it just worked out well. But then if you drive through other cities and you're like, this place sucks. I will never go through here again. The traffic sucks. There's too many mattress stores. There's no places to eat. I don't know where I am. They probably had a very bad planning board, or they grew too rapidly and they couldn't keep up with it and all hell broke loose. So the whole point of the master plan is to kind of have a vision for growth so that way we're not super congested. So that way it stays a desirable place to live, to make sure that there is enough schools, to make sure that there's libraries and parks and things to do. That's exactly right, Jacob. Pittsburgh versus Fuquay. When I said the mattress stores, I was very much talking about Fuquay. I'm glad you caught that, right? It's like the traffic sucks. These mattress stores are everywhere. There's no sense. Yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about.
I lived in Fuquay for like 6 months, and I like Fuquay. It's a cute little town, but it's getting a lot less little. But getting anywhere, I hated driving even 5 minutes away.
Yes, because the traffic, it's so bad. I can't stand it. I told you I lived in Fuquay for a long time. I grew up in Fuquay, and the second I was practical and I found a house out here, I moved away. Not because I didn't like Fuquay, but exactly what you just said. I loved Fuquay, but it's just not worth it with all those lights and the congestion and people don't know how to drive.
Fuquay is great. The feel of Fuquay is great, but literally driving 5 minutes away to get to the Walmart or the Taco Bell or whatever
an hour.
is even if it doesn't take very long, it's a treacherous process.
It is a treacherous process. That's a very good way to put it. That's exactly right. Yeah. So one of the other things that comes into this, folks, is, of course, considerations for development. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but let's just think about it. Would you want to live right next to a manufacturing plant? No. And so that's where zoning comes into play. Okay, so when I say zoning, all zoning is a map where the government of the municipality has looked at it and they said, here's what needs to go here. It's a classification, it's a categorization. As I just told you, my zoning is AR. And so if you look in Johnston County, AR says you can have single-family detached homes, you can have, townhomes, you can have, it'll outline the do's and don'ts. This is okay, this is not okay. That's all zoning is. And understand that there is no one-size-fits-all for zoning. Jacob says mattress stores equals money laundering. It has to be. I don't know what else it can be, because I don't know that many people go to mattress stores, so that's got to be what it is. Or, you know, drugs are in the mattresses, right? Would you like 500 kilos of mattress? Only $6,000, you know? Just cut it open, it's in there. Something like that. So it is basically the government telling you what you can and can't put in a place. And this is exactly why I can't level my house and turn it into an office building. Because if I do, then I'm breaking the law, because this is public. It is police power. They can come and they can arrest me. They can press charges. There's a lot of things that they could do. It's the government. Now, understand that some governments care more than others. You know, it may take some governments a decade before they ever stopped you from doing anything illegal or contrary to your zoning. And others may be on you and throw you in jail faster than you can say, oopsie. It really just depends on the municipality, but it is law. And so, you know, this is all very local in nature. If you were to look at your county and then the next county over, it's different. And then even within your city and your county, it's different. Every city within the city limits, they have their own zoning. But even though I'm in Johnston County, I'm not in the Willow Springs city limits, and so I don't have to deal with Willow Springs zoning. I only have to deal with Johnston County zoning, even though I'm technically in Willow Springs. And so there's no rhyme or reason, because like R1 could be different in Johnston County versus what it is in Clayton city limits. Now, when we're talking about city limits, there is what we call an ETJ. That stands for extraterritorial jurisdiction. Extra meaning outside of, territory meaning the boundaries, and jurisdiction meaning we still have jurisdiction. So in other words, this is where my artistic skills are going to come in handy again. Let's talk about Clayton here. If this is Johnston County as a whole, but then here's Clayton. Clayton has their own zoning in, you know, compartmentalized little sections. This is this is that, this is that, this is this. But then sometimes there's an ETJ, which basically says something like, well, for 3 miles outside, we may not own it, but because it's so close to our stuff, you have to follow our zoning regulations even though you're outside of it. That is an ETJ. Typically, you would have to follow their zoning and their rules, but you wouldn't necessarily have to pay taxes in an ETJ. This is different than annexation. Now, we use that term annexation in the property section where we're talking about real property versus personal property. Annexation was a term used when we took personal property and attached it to the real property and it becomes a fixture. Well, annexation is also the word for absorbing city limits. So sometimes municipalities will expand and they'll say like, okay, well now all of this is in the city limits of Clayton. But that's different than an ETJ. Now understand that there is a big emphasis on the North Carolina test for a real estate broker and their disclosure and helping people understand this. And so let me introduce a term that we're going to get into later tonight, maybe next Monday, called material facts. Material fact is anything that a broker may know, should know, or is considered public knowledge that they would have to disclose to the general public. And the reason is, if it's something that could change the outlook of a person in a transaction, it's what we call a material fact. And so if I was working with a person who wanted to build a restaurant, and we looked at this beautiful piece of property that was perfect for him, perfect location, perfect price, perfect everything, but it was zoned for residential, that would be a material fact. I would have to look him in the face and say, hey, listen, this is zoned residential. You cannot build a restaurant as it currently sits. Now, do understand that we're going to talk about this. You can potentially have a property rezoned. But if I was to let them buy it without telling them about the ramifications of that, without, talking about the pros and cons, what they may be getting themselves into, I've failed as a real estate broker. So it is a material fact for what the zoning is. Can you use this for what you want to use it as? Because that's what the zoning is. Do's and don'ts. What you can and can't do as it currently sits. So here is a visual of what a zoning map looks like. This is just a random municipality. I don't even know where it is, but understand that it is different. There is no rhyme or reason. There's no one size fits all, because you see all of these kind of beigey colors are different types of residential. All of these pinkish to reddish colors are different types of commercial. And so one may say, well, you can have commercial high rise in this dark red up to 70 stories. Pink can only be up to 4 stories. Or, this one can be up to 25 stories. And then, City of Mesa, there you go. Sandeep, Arizona it is. So this is what a zoning map in general looks like. It is, and please understand that these are very large geographical areas. Okay, this is like miles, miles, and miles, not just like small little itty bitty pieces. Kirsten, this is where you grew up. Listen, I'm like, well, who knows where the hell this is? And everybody's like, oh, I know this place. I've been there. There's actually a Panera right there on the corner, right? Like, all right, well, whatever. The Panera is right between the brown and the yellow, right? Right there, that little blue. That's Panera. We used to go there all the time when I was in college. I was waiting for you to say that it actually was a Panera, Kirsten. You're about to say something. You're like, but actually. What? Gilbert and McKellips? That's where the Panera is? Okay. I'm like, is that a restaurant? I've never heard of that. Like, we don't have Paneras there. We have a Gilbert and McKellips. Their ham sandwich.
No, Gilbert and McKellips. So if you look here on the map, you can actually see they're on a grid system. A nice little one-tile grid system. Gilbert and McKellips. That's the crossroads.
Oh, Gilbert. I see. Nerd. I'm kidding. So this is exactly, and folks, the reason is, as I said, people don't want to live next to, big industrial manufacturing plants. Now, does it happen sometimes? Yeah, but we want to create a place that is desirable to live, that has flowing traffic, that, just works. And that's kind of the whole point of the zoning. We kind of make it flow the way that they want it to. Now, please understand, though, this is not finite and it's not forever. The only one constant is change. And so sometimes the planning boards will come in and they'll say, okay, well, this was a residential area, this yellow right here, but maybe we've decided that we want to switch this to industrial for some reason or another. They can come in and they can go through a process, and it's called rezoning, which would change the allowable use. It happens all the time, which leads us into some very testable terminology, folks. What you got, Jacob?
Does it have to be empty property to rezone?
No.
Okay, so does that mean that if somebody had a house there, they would have to tear down their house? Right? I mean, or is it just like, okay, it's just everything else around this area. It doesn't affect the places that are already built, but it's the other stuff.
Yes. That's actually the next slide. You're asking a fantastic question. Very fantastic question. So Jacob's question was, well, if it's rezoned, like I built a house here, now it's zoned commercial, what does that mean for me? You're allowed to keep it, okay? This is exactly the thing you have to understand. There are a lot of different testable terminologies within this section. Okay, so let me introduce first, before you look at this slide, listen to me. There is what we call a non-conforming use. If I say non-conforming, that means does not conform. And so that means it is contrary to the zoning. So if you had a house in a commercial area, that would be non-conforming. If you had a restaurant in a residential area, that is non-conforming. It does not meet the current zoning. Now understand that non-conforming is a generalization saying it doesn't meet the current use. But we have to dive into a more specific way of looking at this. And that is what we call a legal non-conforming use and an illegal non-conforming use, also sometimes just referred to as an illegal use. So as Jacob just asked, here's the answer. If you have a house in an area that has been residential zoning for the past 20 years, and the government comes in and says this is a hustling and bustling area, we need some commercial, and they rezone your whole area commercial. They will not force you to move out of your house. They will not demolish it, and they will not do anything to you. They will allow you to continue to exist as a legal non-conforming use. You are grandfathered in. So way to look at it. They say, yes, we changed the zoning, but you're fine. It's called a legal non-conforming use. You're not meeting the current zoning, but it's okay because your building was there first before we changed the zoning. What you got, Justin?
Is that kind of similar to what happened with they built their mall around this lady's house?
No, that mall, I know exactly what you're talking about. Understand that that was a private commercial developer who wanted that land. And so people who are not the government can't force you to sell them their land. So what they typically do is they come and just offer you a pretty penny to buy you out. That lady was just stubborn and refused to sell her house. And so all the other landowners sold it to the developer, but she didn't. And she held out. And so that was what happened. Everybody else sold the land, she didn't. And so they had to build it around her. But it didn't have to. Now, understand, let me kind of go off on a tangent here, Justin, because this kind of leads into another subject. With that scenario, if you're not familiar with it, it's exactly what Justin said. There was a bunch of residential homes and they wanted to build a shopping mall. And so this developer bought out all the other homes to build this complex, this shopping mall, this whatever. Well, folks, understand that that area was zoned residential. But when you are a big multi-million, multi-billion-dollar developer who is bringing a lot of jobs and a lot of money into the area, you go to the planning board and you ask for rezoning. If you have deep pockets and you pay the right people and you know the right people, you can get the property rezoned. Hold on. Sorry, I don't know why. Everybody at my house is just on another level tonight. Like my kids are out there yelling. It's distracting me. The dog was in here. So we're going to get into rezoning in a second. Okay, rezoning is not something that you or I could do, but with deep pockets and knowing the right people, that's how commercial developers typically do things. They get it rezoned. So a legal non-conforming use is you are grandfathered in. We changed the zoning. Now let me flip it the other way because I want you to understand this. All right, let's say that you were operating a grocery store in an area that was zoned commercial and a grocery store was an allowable use. And then they come in and they change that area to residential. They're going to allow you to keep operating your grocery store as a legal non-conforming use. But you have to understand that, of course, the government eventually does want you to conform. And so they may put limitations on your existence. They're not going to allow you to expand. They're not going to allow you to turn into a different business. They may or may not allow you to sell it as that business. They typically will, but it has to be the exact same one. Sometimes they'll say it only has to be inherited. So if I wanted to expand my parking lot as the grocery store owner and I bought an adjacent piece of property or applied for a permit to redo my parking lots, it's probably going to be denied. Same thing too. If my building ever caught on fire, they're just going to tell me to take the insurance money and sell it as a residential land. They're not going to let me rebuild it. Now, as long as I jump through their loopholes and nothing ever happens to my property, I could continue operating as a legal non-conforming use forever. They will not just come to me and say, stop it. But they will typically make some rules and some loopholes so that eventually, if something happens, I can't continue anymore. Okay? Now, the opposite of that is the illegal use. If I was to buy that residential lot and build a restaurant, that is just a blatant illegal use. Because I built something non-conforming from the word go. Now, please understand the difference here. Let's say that I have a condominium on an area where it is illegal to have a condominium. And then I turn around and sell it to you. You will not be grandfathered in. If you purchase an illegal use, it's still an illegal use. Grandfather is dealing with the zoning change, but you were conforming before the zoning change. So make sure you understand, non-conforming just means not meeting the current zoning, and it could be legal, grandfathered in, or illegal, depending. So let's talk about a couple more pieces of terminology that come into this section. Sometimes you can be granted what is called a conditional use permit, sometimes referred to as a special use permit. So if you look at the zoning, it may be something that's not specifically allowed or disallowed, but may be given on a, case by case or special use basis. In other words, residential area can have churches so long as there's not more than, 3 churches within a 10-mile block, or a private school, or so they may have conditions or special uses. Yes, you can do this, but only if there's no more than X amount, or as long as you don't have more than 500 people each service, or whatever it may be. So it's basically needing special permissions. They don't change the zoning, but they are allowing you to create whatever this thing is in this particular zoning. It's typically for the use of somebody like in a residential area. Like I said, private school, or, a church, or, maybe a grocery store or something like that. Now I want to talk about a variance, because understand that I just mentioned rezoning with commercial, and that is a huge thing to do. A variance and rezoning are very different. And so I'm going to give you one of the easiest examples I can give you for a variance. Okay, variance may be granted for somebody who is disproportionately affected by the current zoning, and it impedes your use specifically, right? Some undue hardship that doesn't affect everybody else. So I'm going to try to give you a pretty simple example of this. Let me go back to my little cul-de-sac drawing here. And you purchase a lot at the back of the cul-de-sac. And the other lots are a little bit different than yours for whatever reason. So you buy this lot right here. And because your driveway is so narrow, when you buy this lot, you go to build a house on it, and you realize that your zoning includes setback lines of 20 feet. Folks, setbacks is when you can't build within a certain amount. So if we had setback lines of 20 feet, it means you can't build anything within 20 feet of this side. You can't build within 20 feet of this side. Can't build within 20 feet of this side. And let's say even worse than that, your zoning says if there's any creeks, you have to have a riparian buffer of another 20 feet. And you got a creek running through your backyard. And so because of all these things together, you now have a lot that you don't even have the ability to build a house on. Because what if the zoning now says, well, you can't have a house smaller than 1,000 square feet. By the way, that's a very common zoning ordinance. Just so you understand the word ordinance, when I say zoning, zoning is the map that says R1, R2, R whatever. Ordinances are the rules within. So when I said the can do and can't do's, that's called ordinances. It's the list of rules within that zoning. So let's say that because of the restrictions on the size of the unit, the riparian buffer, and the setbacks, you couldn't build a house here. You could potentially go and you could request a variance to ignore the 20-foot setbacks and maybe build within 10 feet of your property line because of this undue hardship that only affects you. So they may give you permission to ignore one small rule. They didn't change the zoning, but they basically gave you permission to ignore that one small rule. Setbacks you can ignore, you can build within 10 feet. But normally it's 20 feet. Does that make sense for everybody? Please understand that there's no guarantee they'll give it to you, and in fact, typically they deny them. That's a variance, just requesting a minor exception because of some undue hardship that has nothing to do with me. So let's talk about the next one. This is just more terminology. Folks, I'm going to be honest with you. Most of this stuff is vocabulary. You are not going to have crazy in-depth analytical questions on this public and private land use controls. It's going to be, tell me what this is. What's the difference between this and that? Like, it's not going to be anything crazy. So this is vocab, for lack of a better way of looking at it. So here's another one called an overlay district. Okay, an overlay district is just when we've got multiple types of zoning superimposed on top of each other. And so let me start with one because I don't want to confuse it. Folks, I want you to look at this slide right here, and I want you to realize that these two things are very separate things. And the reason I have to say that is because a lot of students will get them confused because they're on the same slides and because this one is a good example of that, but they're not the same thing. So let me give you a different example and then I'll explain. If you had an area that was a high traffic area in Raleigh, you know, like Glenwood Avenue, and you got all the homes on each side of the road. Well, all of that is going to be a type of residential zoning because they are homes that people live in. But because it is a high traffic area, the city of Raleigh may also have an additional zoning on top of it called an aesthetic preservation zoning, meaning it has to look pretty so you don't make our city look ugly. And so that zoning could say, well, you can't have these colors, or it has to be made of a certain material, or it has to, the city could impose zoning rules to make sure that it is not an eyesore to a high traffic area. So that's an overlay district, right? Because you've got residential, maybe R2, and aesthetic preservation zoning, or just aesthetic zoning is the better way to say it, so you don't confuse it. Just aesthetic zoning. Does that make sense? There's two superimposed over each other, and you would have to follow the rules of both. So now that you understand what an overlay district is with two different types of zoning over each other, this is where I can tell you historic preservation is another example of that. Let's use Raleigh as the example again. There's a lot of old homes in Raleigh. And in these older homes, if they are considered historic in nature, certain municipalities will create what's called a historic preservation zoning. And so they will impose rules like you can't tear the house down. You may have to get special permits or grants to do any kind of repairs. They have to look the same as they always have because you have to meet this historic criteria. So buying a house may be a type of residential, but it may also be a historic preservation zoning. So it could be both. That is another overlay district. Josh says, did they just place those zoning laws for Glenwood? Lots of renovation, construction near there? No, there's just a lot of really large old lots that way. And because the market has kind of gone the way that it has, a lot of people are purchasing these older homes, tearing them down, splitting the lots into two because they're big enough, and then building, multi-million-dollar homes and then turning around and selling them. So a lot of, we'll call it revitalization. But yeah, there's other words for it. Yeah. Everybody okay with all these so far? Just a lot of vocab. These are those flashcard things. Here's that one I just mentioned. Aesthetic zoning just has to meet a certain color scheme, certain construction, because it is a high traffic area. It's called an aesthetic zoning. May require certain trees, may require, things of that nature. Spot zoning is an interesting one. I told you zoning in general is a very large nature, right? Miles, at least multiple blocks. Spot zoning would be where the municipality has come in and they have granted a very small little area of rezoning. So let's just use Raleigh as an example again. We got this whole little block of Raleigh and all of it is commercial only. And none of these poor people can get a parking lot because it does not fall into the allowable uses under this commercial zoning. But one property owner somehow convinces the planning board to rezone this one little pocket, and so now they can have a parking lot. Very small area rezoned within a larger parcel. It's called spot zoning. Now the interesting thing about spot zoning is it typically has the look of impropriety. If you didn't know, this stuff is very political. And so if you are making donations to the commissioners and the planning board members' campaigns, they're sometimes more likely to approve your rezoning requests and approvals for development. And so if they were to come in and grant some rezoning like this that is very unfair and not for the public interest, that would constitute illegalities, and you could actually go to like a superior judge and have it overturned because it's showing favoritism. That's spot zoning. Just rezoning a small little area that doesn't seem to be it may or may not be in the public interest, but if it's not, that would have the look of impropriety and it could be overturned by a judge. There's a few more of these terminologies. Next one is cluster zoning. Cluster zoning, think of cul-de-sacs. Okay, cluster zoning is a type of zoning where we put the properties closer together so that we maximize the green space or the extra space in a development. Like having cul-de-sacs and, walkways and HOA and greenways. Anytime the houses are closer together so we can maximize the land use elsewhere, that's a cluster zoning. That's all it is. And then a buffer zone goes back to what I said before. If we had a big old area that was residential, and then over here is industrial. Well, we don't really want the industrial butting right up. So we may have what's called a buffer zoning in between these two, where it has to have a park or trees or forest, so then that way you're not staring right into the back of a manufacturing plant or something like that. That's all buffer zoning is. This kind of separates residential from commercial or some other type of zoning. So let me take a second to talk about the rezoning process. I told you, big, high-dollar developers, think about like Apple. Folks, we all heard Apple's coming to RTP. That's in the works. When big businesses like that come into an area and they want to build a campus, build a manufacturing plant, build whatever, because it brings so much money, as I said before, and jobs into the area, the government, the municipalities, the planning boards will make special deals. And so they come in and they start saying, well, it's going to bring this many jobs, it's going to bring this many this, and it's going to bring... And so they will typically allow it to be rezoned for the commercial developers. Now, sometimes before they do that, there is, of course, them wanting to change it because of the differences in the master plan. Regardless of the reasoning for this potential change, it goes through a process. First, it's informing the public that there is a potential rezoning change, and they may have a public comment period. And then they may say, okay, well, it's been confirmed, but it's not going to go into place until X amount of time. Regardless of the status, understand that whether it be pending, being discussed, or actually confirmed, all of these would constitute material facts. Because yet again, if I had a restaurateur who wanted to buy a commercial property to build a restaurant on, and there was discussions of them turning it into residential, if it turns residential before he builds his restaurant, he's screwed. Because a legal non-conforming use, you'd have to have already built it. So if he buys it, and before he files his permits to build his restaurant, it's residential, they're going to deny it. So all these things would constitute those material facts, that term I said earlier, that the general public would need to know in order to make good decisions on whether or not they want to move forward. And I promise, based on what I'm reading on the syllabus, this is very testable in North Carolina. An agent's obligation to discover and disclose zoning and potential use issues for their client. Josh says, would cluster zoning be defined as the aforementioned with a new development in Glenwood? No. Not so much, because those are still just individual parcels along the side of a street, and you're potentially subdividing it and putting them closer together, but it's not really concerned about green space or additional space. So cluster zoning is just a bunch of units closer together, which would allow you to have more green space. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have that, but so let's talk about another big and testable one that would also constitute a material fact. When a developer is building those subdivisions, as I've been talking about, and they come in and they cut these roads, after they get this approval, we're going to talk about approval in a second. After they get approval and they start cutting in these roads and creating these new roads, well, it is possible for a road to be either public or private. If a road is private, that means yet again, private property owners would be obligated to take care of it. If a road is public, that means that the Department of Transportation, the DOT, has adopted it and they are maintaining it. Now, the way that happens is the developer would have to build that road to DOT specifications. There is a set of rules, how thick it has to be, how wide it has to be, how much public right-of-way it has to be. After they meet that criteria, they can file paperwork, which is called dedication, where they basically look at the DOT and say, we built these roads, we want you to have them. It's called dedication. Now understand that dedication is not the same thing as acceptance. It's not until the DOT officially accepts or adopts them that they become public roads. And that sometimes takes a while. And so this would be a material fact, because think about it. Folks, we talked about special assessments. Imagine moving into a house, buying it, only to realize after the fact that the road is a private road. There's all these potholes and cracks, and you get a notice in the mail that a special assessment has been levied against your property for $30,000 for road repair. That's a surprise, isn't it? But if it is a Department of Transportation maintained road, a public road, then any of those issues will be handled by the Department of Transportation in 1 to 10 business years. A couple of y'all caught that, right? Y'all know how the DOT operates. They'll get there when they get there. You don't rush them. So here's that dedication versus acceptance, okay? And so a developer would have to disclose whether or not their intention was for it to be public versus private at the time of development, and a real estate broker would have to disclose it as well, whether it was public or private. Now, side note, North Carolina, what we call the RPAC, the Realtor Political Action Committee, they will not show up on your test in any way, shape, and form, lobbied the government in North Carolina, the DOT in North Carolina, several years ago to create a more detailed database on what streets were public or private. And they've actually done a good job. It's better than it used to be. Is it perfect? No, but it's way better. That being said, folks.
Private roads.
Oh, go ahead. What?
Little yellow sign in the corner, like how it's like the green, and then but they have a little yellow like PVT.
Yeah, that's not even enough. Some people don't even have private on private roads. So, I mean, you could see it, not identified as a private road, and it still may be a private road, and then vice versa. But yeah, I mean, those are definitely private roads. Folks, go take a break. So, we're talking about public versus private roads, dedication versus acceptance, and then, of course, how this constitutes a material fact as a real estate broker, and we'll talk more about material facts as we get into the agency section some more. I want to talk about another thing that has historically been pretty testable in North Carolina. Okay, and I also want to make sure that you understand something so you don't confuse it with other concepts, because as I've said, I've been teaching this for years, and I've seen the mistakes that students have a tendency to make, so I always try to warn you about them. So, right here, this is talking about subdivision regulations. Now, I want you to understand that subdivision regulations is a public land use control. Please do not confuse this with subdivision restrictive or protective covenants, which is a private land use control. And so subdivision regulations are this concept of you need permission before you can build a subdivision, if it at least meets the criteria of a subdivision. Now, here's the problem. When I say subdivision, most of you are probably thinking about, something that's 20 plus, 100 plus or whatever lots. But the definition of a subdivision is any time that you subdivide, meaning turn a piece of land into 2 or more properties with the intent to develop, build, or sell. Or any time that you have created a new street. And so if you go out and you buy a 50-acre parcel and you want to turn it into 25 lots, 50 lots, 75 lots, create a new street and then develop those and then build on them and sell them, you can't do that without going through the planning board. You would have to get approval to create this subdivision. Now, here's some of the most testable things from a North Carolina point of view on this. And you've got to understand, too, the flow of things. I keep using the terms developer and builder, so let me just paint the picture here, folks. Sometimes the developer and the builder are the same people. Other times they are different. I said developers go out and they buy property. Builders build things. And so let's just use that as the relationship. If a developer was to buy 100 acres and they're going to turn it into a 220 lot subdivision, they would have to go through, they would hire a civil engineer to draw out the plans and a surveyor to draw out the maps, and they would submit it to the planning board for approval. It would typically go through a public hearing process, and then once they got what's called preliminary plat approval, they could then start marketing the properties for sale. So they approve it at the planning board meeting. They're going to start developing it after that. Once it's approved, that's all it takes to market them for sale. That's all it takes to contract on these lots. But understand that even if you contract on them at that point, you cannot transfer ownership over until the final plat map has been recorded. So the preliminary approval is recorded at the planning board's office. The final plat map is recorded in the Register of Deeds. And that's a very important distinction that you have to make. I know it's testable. So you can start marketing and contracting once you have preliminary plat approval. But you cannot transfer ownership, transfer title until the final plat map has been recorded. And of course, understand that if what you contract on is materially different than what you get, then you can back out with no penalties. And so let me give you an example of how that could happen. Let me draw my beautiful little subdivision again. If this was one phase of the plat map, and maybe you purchased this lot right here, and come to find out there wasn't enough usable soils for a septic, and so you have your initial septic here and your drain lines here, but then they cut off another piece of property over here and they said this is your repair field. Well, that is materially different than what you contracted on, and so you were allowed to back out without penalties.
So does that mean that they could, right, if you put earnest money?
They'd have to give it all back.
Okay.
Yep. They cannot keep a penny of it. They have to give everything back and let you terminate with no penalties. Now, this is typically the relationship between the builder. Folks, in that scenario, these lots are developed typically, I say typically because it can be different, by the developer. And then what will happen is a builder will come in and they will purchase like all of these lots in one fell swoop. It's called a takedown. So they're going to purchase all of these lots together as a builder. And so they may contract to purchase this phase as the developer starts working on it. And then when it changes, the builder could in theory back out because it's materially different with no penalties. But just to kind of understand the flow of how these things work. But all it takes is to be defined as a subdivision. And as a reminder, the subdivision regulations are a public land use control, not private. Do not confuse them with subdivision restrictive covenants or protective covenants. Okay, that's private versus subdivision regulations, which are public. So 2 or more lots with the intention to build, develop, or sell, or any time that you're creating a new road. If you own a 500-acre parcel and you wanted to split it into 2 or 3, just because, you don't need permission for that. Because you're not doing it with intention to develop, build, or sell. And you're not creating new roads. So the last couple notes under these subdivision regulations, because this is a public land use control, it would be a criminal thing to sell lots in an unapproved subdivision. Public is police power. And then, of course, while you're cutting in that road, you would have to disclose whether that road is going to be private or public as a developer. And then if there are any protective covenants, they would, of course, be enforceable on all purchasers of the property. Those protective covenants are the only piece of this that is that private land use control. And when I say protective covenants, restrictive covenants, same thing. Same thing. And so just in that same note, as I already said, okay, you can contract on them once the preliminary is approved, but no transfer of ownership until the final plat map has been recorded. So these are just supplemental notes that I've already said out loud.
The previous slide said comply with street what?
Disclosure
Street disclosure
laws.
And what does that mean?
Whether the street, disclosing whether the street is public, intended to be public or private.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Meaning, are we going to build it to DOT standards and intend to turn it over to the DOT, the Department of Transportation, making it public? Or do we intend for there to be some type of road maintenance agreement where it's private? Folks, some streets are maintained as private. And so then the HOA would collect money to have on reserve in case they needed to repave them or anything like that. It is possible. It still happens, but it's not as common. Most people want the DOT to handle them, so they typically turn them over to the public, to the Department of Transportation.
Say if someone, okay, so I have a friend back at home that they live on a private road, and it's multiple homes like back in on that private road, but the street is horrible. Like the street is horrible, but there's a big huge sign, like almost like a construction sign that says private road, no trespassing or no through traffic or something like that. If somebody were to purchase a home back there, and they complain about the road conditions, would there be anything that the local government could do? Or
so the short answer is no. The longer answer is maybe. And so if you complain to the Department of Transportation, they're not going to just take care of it, but could you have somebody potentially come in and take care of it? But understand, if a governmental authority comes in,
special assessment.
There you go. They may do it, but then they're going to say, here's your bill. And so the way that works is if there's a house here, house here, house here, they're basically going to take the total cost and divide it by the amount of linear feet that you have. So if you've got more road frontage, you're paying for this section. You're paying for this section. Now there's homes on both sides. They're dividing it between the two, right? So this section would be split between you two. This section would be split between you two. But you're going to get a big old fat bill, and it's going to be attached to your property as a special assessment. Yep.
And that would be voluntary or involuntary. So even the people that are living beside me, if they're affected, would be levied against them as well.
Yeah. That is an involuntary lien. You didn't ask for it. This is going to happen. Yep. So then the last note on this, and as I said, I've already kind of mentioned all these things. If sometimes, folks, I keep saying change to preliminary plat. If the final plat map is different than the preliminary, they have the right to get out with no penalties. Well, how could this happen? I showed you the septic tanks, but sometimes when they go to cutting these roads, there's bedrock, limestone, things that they can't just move because it would cost too much in dynamite, and so sometimes they just reroute stuff. So there's a lot of reasons why things could change from the initial map that was drawn versus the final that's recorded. So one last warning, just going to reiterate it one more time because I see it happen all the time. Do not mix up subdivision regulations with restrictive covenants. Subdivision regulations are a public land use control, the government. Subdivision restrictive covenants are a private land use control. The previous owner, aka the developer, imposes those restrictive covenants. Two very different things. Now, the next thing that we're going into is probably not a crazy testable thing in any way, shape, and form. I would be just surprised if you have more than one question on this one thing. It's just such a random thing, okay? And there is what we call the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act, and it is triggered under very specific circumstances. It is not a common thing in any way, shape, or form. So this says applies to the sale or lease of most subdivisions containing 25 or more lots that are marketed across state lines. The reason is you've got areas like Charlotte, which are right on like the North Carolina, South Carolina border. Okay, there's a lot of cities like that, depending on the different states. And so somebody could just as easily live in South Carolina as they could in North Carolina in that area. And so you have to understand that when you're in a different state, you have different taxes, you have different soils, you have different zoning, you have a lot of things. And so it is just a law or rule that makes sure that we disclose certain things that the general public might not know about the opposite state. Because things can change from state to state. The way that we talk about things can change from state to state. That's why we have a state section of the real estate exam. So it has to be 25 or more lots, and it has to be marketed directly across state lines. What this requires is a property report given to the potential buyer or lessee, if it was that situation, but typically the buyer. And it has to contain certain essential things that they may not think to ask that they would need to know about the opposite state. It also has a 7-day rescission period associated with it. Now here's your pop quiz. What else did we talk about in this class that had a 7-day rescission period?
Condos.
Yes. Oh no. Everyone loves condos.
It is condos, but it's not enough to just say condos.
New construction condos?
New construction condos specifically. Resale condominiums do not have any rescission period in North Carolina. There you go. All right. 7-day rescission period on new construction condos in North Carolina under the North Carolina Condominium Act. 7-day rescission period under the Interstate Land Sale Full Disclosure Act as well. Now, the items that have to be disclosed: the distance over the paved roads to nearby communities, number of homes currently occupied, 25% out of the 100 or whatever it may be, soil conditions affecting foundations and septic systems, meaning is this more sandy soil, is it more clay-like soil, types of title buyer receives, are they getting a general warranty deed, is it fee simple absolute, whatever it may be, and then of course any existence of liens on the property. That's it, folks. Are you going to need to memorize any of these things on this slide? No. Go ahead and take the notes, but you're not going to need to memorize it. There's no way they're asking you these specifics on something so arbitrary. So let's get into something probably a little more pertinent and necessary. And this is where I'm going to kind of tie it back into previous topics we've discussed in the past. Building codes. Okay, you've heard me say this. We talked about it when we were talking about the real versus personal property section. Building codes are a public land use control. But understand that building codes, while they are a public land use control, do not group them in the same area as zoning. That's like comparing apples to oranges. Yes, they're both fruits, but they're not the same. Well, building codes and zoning are both public land use controls, but they're not the same. Zoning is what you can and can't do in a certain area. Building codes are minimum construction standards for safety. There are building codes for every type of property. Building codes for stick-built homes, attached, detached, high-rises. When you get into a, commercial building that's 100 stories tall, you need a lot deeper footers and foundation systems than you do for a standard single family detached residential. So if you've ever watched any HGTV and they're renovating and you hear them say something like, oh, the studs have to be 16 inches on center, that's a building code. That is the minimum, not the maximum, the minimum construction standard you have to meet in that area, that every single stud has to be at least 16 inches apart from center to center. Same thing, there are certain insulation ratings that have to be met, certain footer things have to be met. Now, there are both statewide and local, sometimes, building codes. And so if you were to buy a piece of dirt and build a home and apply for a permit, they're going to say, okay, it has to meet these building codes. And so what happens is when a builder is building a home, the county inspector comes out every step of the way after they get the permit approved, and they'll look at the foundation. They say, yep, it meets the code. They'll sign off on it. And then the framing happens, and they come out and they say, yep, it meets the code. They'll sign off on it. And then the rough ends, the insulation, the drywall, all these different pieces will come into play, and they'll sign off on it. And then the final inspection comes up, and they look at everything, and they make sure that it checks all the boxes for the state or local building codes. And then that is when they will issue what is called the CO, the Certificate of Occupancy. And all that states is that it is safe for human occupancy. It meets these minimum construction standards of safety. Now, back when we were talking about the ownerships and interest in real property, we talked about manufactured versus modular homes. I told you manufactured, also called mobile home, also called trailer, are exempt from meeting building codes. But modular homes that are built in sections and considered real property as soon as they're put on a foundation have to meet the state building codes, just like any site built or stick built home. So if you were to build a house without getting it permitted, without getting the CO, that would be a material fact. Same thing with just a room. Folks, when you own a house, if there's like unfinished attic space somewhere and you decide to go and finish it, technically you need to pull a permit. And the permit's going to do the same thing. They're going to make sure that you finish it to meet these standards in the area. Is your framing right? Is your insulation right? Do you have the appropriate number of outlets? All these different things. So if you finish a room without getting it permitted, that is a material fact. Yet again, you would have to disclose to the general public that this space was in fact unpermitted.
I, about 2 years ago, finished my dad's attic for him, and the inspectors told us that our, like the rafters on the ceiling didn't come down low enough, or well, it's not that, but they didn't come down low enough to fit a thick enough insulation for it to match inspection. And so I had to take 2x4s and sideways add them to every single rafter. It took so long.
Yeah,
it was
reinforce them lower so you'd have more space above.
Yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep, that's how it goes. So building codes are a public land use control. They are a minimum construction standard of safety. Could you build it more than that? If you wanted to put studs every 12 inches, you go for it. But at minimum, you have to have one every 16 inches. And that's just a generalization that most people have heard before, which is why I use that as an example. So it is a public land use control, but comparing it to the zoning, it is like apples and oranges. Zoning regulates the use of land. What can and can't go there. Building codes are just how they have to be built. Josh says, does exceeding the code have any effect on the price? In general, no. But of course, a custom-built house that may be built to the nines and you can advertise it as, solid as a rock, may have some ramifications that increase the value. But typically, not a dollar for dollar. It's very costly to go like nuts because lumber's so expensive and concrete's so expensive. So not a big correlation typically. So let's talk about another thing that kind of doesn't really have it can be taught in different sections, but I'm going to even talk about it here while we're talking about permits and codes and building and things of that nature. And that is an on-site septic system. Okay. Folks, a septic system is a waste disposal system. And depending on where you live, they are very common in North Carolina. North Carolina, and especially the Triangle, has certain areas that are so populated that it is very hard to have a water treatment facility that would keep up with the amount of the population. And so, especially once again in Johnston County, things like septics are prevalent. So let me tell you what a septic is. A septic system is when you've got your house. By the way, I'm an artist. Then you got your yard. And then out in your yard, okay, when you flush everything in your house, all water runs out to a pipe into a big old cement tank in your ground. It's called a septic tank. So all waste water goes in, and there's typically 2 compartments separated by this wall, and there's a what's called baffle wall in between that allows stuff to flow through. And so everything flows into this side, and once it hits a certain level, all the liquids will move into this side, and once it hits a certain level, it goes out into what's called a distribution box. And then there's what we call drain fields or leach lines out in your yard, and a lot of times they'll zigzag. So all your wastewater from your house goes into your yard. And the wastewater gets filtered through the soil, the sediments, the sand, and all those things and make it back into the natural aquifers. It is a great filtration system. And that is a septic tank. They are great. They work fine. But there are a couple big things to understand about septics. You don't ever put anything down the drains other than toilet paper. Ever. Ever. There is no such thing as flushable wipes. I don't care what they're selling it to you as. There's no such thing. So if you believe there is, stop it right now. No such thing. So you don't want to put any fats, greases, oils, feminine products, nothing down there like that, because that can cause blockages. Now, folks, understand, if there's a big old clog of grease right here and the water can't get out, what's going to happen in your house? Yeah, grossness. Poop water is going to back up into your house. Ain't nobody got time for that negativity. So septics are very functional and they work fine. Here's an interesting thing that you may or may not have known. In order to look at your septic permit, a septic is permitted for a certain number of bedrooms. And so you would look for this information from the county environmental and or health department. It depends on the county. In Johnston County, it's called the environmental department. In some counties, it's called environmental and health, and some it's just called health department. So if you ever see that on a test, it's one of those. Environmental and health, or health department. And so what happens is the developer, should I say the builder, will apply for a septic as a waste disposal system, and they'll come out and they'll check the soils. They used to do what's called a perk test, as in what your coffee does, percolates. And basically what they would do is they would dig a hole in the ground and they would dump water and they would time to see how long it took for that water to disappear. That was the old school perk test. Well, we're a little more fancy in 2024, folks. Now it's called a soil suitability analysis. So they basically take a soil sample, do some tests on it to figure out what type of soil you have and how quickly it will dissipate the water. And based on how quickly it'll dissipate the water, they will give your septic a rating. It is dependent on your soils, it is dependent on the size of your tank, and it is dependent on how many lines you have. Because you can have anywhere from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 lines. And it's based on a gallons per hour kind of rating system. And so it is based on a number of bedrooms, not bathrooms. And so let me give you an example of this and why this is important for you. If you are a real estate broker in North Carolina and we're dealing with septic tanks, you can only ever market a house for the number of bedrooms that are allocated on the septic permit. If you were to call it any more than that, you have lied. I'm going to use that word because I haven't introduced the actual word yet, but you've lied, and you can be in trouble for lying as a real estate broker. So let me give you a real world example of that. My house that I'm currently sitting in Willow Springs, North Kakalaki, is on a septic system. My house is over 3,100 square feet. I got 6 rooms. 5 of them have windows, doors, closets. My house is on a 3-bedroom septic permit. So when I go to sell this house, I can advertise it as a 3-bedroom, 3 bonus room. Or I can get creative and advertise it as a 3-bedroom, 1 bonus, 1 media, and 1 playroom. But I cannot call it more than a 3-bedroom house because the septic permit does not allow it. Now, the reasons it's bedrooms, not bathrooms, think about it. If you had a mansion with 17 bathrooms, but 1 person lived there, that septic tank ain't getting a whole lot of use. Only 1 man can only do so much with 17 toilets, okay? But if you live in a house with 1 bathroom and 20 people are living there, that poor toilet is screaming for help. You see how I'm saying here? So these permits are based on bedrooms, and it's based on a premise of double occupancy. In theory, a 3-bedroom septic could have 6 adults living in there, and it could keep up. Double occupancy per bedroom is what it's rated for. Jacob, yet for the new construction, have several locations where we have 5 or 6 bedroom homes that we can only list and sell as 4 bedrooms. Yeah, so you say things like lives like, 4-bedroom house lives like 6 or something like that. Yeah, and that's just the rule. Because if you're not familiar with the differentiation, sewer is where when you flush, it goes off-site to a water treatment plant. And so sewer is a pay per flush thing. You have a bill of water coming in on your city sewer. You have a bill of water going out on city sewer. And so there's no restriction on sewer because you can just flush as many times as you want. Just you pay more money. So that is an important thing as a real estate broker. You can be in trouble for not disclosing that it's a septic versus a sewer. You can be in trouble for advertising it as the wrong number of bedrooms when the permit is only for this many. Now, of course, there are sometimes other restrictions like, no garbage disposals because that, once again, can cause issues, just depending. So a couple things to be aware of. This is just continuing what I said. Max occupancy, 2 persons per bedroom. Capacity is determined from the septic permit. In theory, it is possible to get your system upgraded. Like, let's say, for instance, at the time this house was built, it's 3. And I've made additions onto it. I didn't, but if I did, sometimes you just have to go in and add an extra line, and you can have a new permit issued by the environmental department. But it's not very common to do that. One other piece of terminology while we're on this subject that kind of goes hand in hand with it, right? Septic and sewer are both waste disposal systems. But there is a terminology you need to know, and you could argue that it's in this section. You could argue that it's in environmental. Either way, it's potentially testable. And that is straight piping. You need to know that terminology. Straight piping is where it just basically leaves your house and goes into a hole. That is illegal in the United States, okay? Straight piping is not an acceptable form of waste disposal. Misty, the actual drain lines had to be dug out and replaced? Do you think it was your boy's fault, or did they fail because soils got back into them? Because that's a common occurrence.
Oh no, I found socks in them.
Yep, there you go. Okay, that'll do it. It's a very expensive fix. It's not cheap. So straight piping is illegal. That is a term you could see on the test. It is where there is just, like I said, a hole in the ground that it goes into. The tank is a very specific system that's designed to eliminate the waste. But straight piping would be just everything runs out of your house into the yard, into a creek, into a hole, whatever it may be. I'll never forget it. There was a student one time I was teaching this, and come to find out, she lived in a house that used to be on septic, she thought, but then it got tied in. I can't remember the exact story. Either way, it was marketed as being tied into city sewer. And of course, she believed it because she was getting a sewer bill. Come to find out, about a year after she purchased it, that it was not tied into the sewer and that it was just dumping into the yard. And she didn't ever realize this, but they were charging, I would have been livid if somebody was charging me a sewer bill for almost a year and it was just going into my yard. I'm like, you about to reimburse me for every penny I paid you. All right, we'll cut plus interest. Yeah, Kirsten, I'm not really sure of the story on how they didn't smell it. Maybe it was like buried in the ground, and so it's just going into a hole in the ground. I don't know exactly how they found it, but it's the weirdest thing. And she ended up having she went after the seller or the listing agent who marketed it, and somebody had to pay for it to have be tied in. It wasn't her because of disclosure issues or whatever it was. So we're almost done with this section. Just a couple more little notes and highlights on these different topics, okay? Government land ownership, it's exactly what it sounds like. Of course, the government owns certain properties, sometimes parks, streets, highways, these public things, schools that are public. There are a lot of areas that do not necessarily fall under, just normal jurisdiction because they are governmental buildings. Nothing too crazy there. That's just a statement. Nobody panic about that. That's common sense stuff. So here's another one to throw into the mix here, and it kind of has a home in multiple sections, like a lot of things do. You'll hear me teach a topic, and then I'll typically talk about it later in another context and kind of tie back to it, like we did with the manufactured and the building codes and things of that nature. But here's the next mention, okay, flood hazard regulations. Now, the flood hazards come into this because you could be dealing with an overlay district as well. Maybe you're in a residential area, but it's also a recognized floodplain. And so there's special restrictions because it is prone to flooding for zoning. So that could cause an overlay district. But when we're dealing with flooding, all of these areas are designated by what is called FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, I believe is the acronym there. Certain municipalities have local flood maps, but ultimately everybody goes by the FEMA maps. They've been redrawn within the past couple years because of the big hurricanes and unprecedented flooding that we have had, especially in our area over the past few years. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about this in the insurance, which is why I told you it kind of bleeds into different sections. But let me ask you a question, folks. If you have a house that is located in a floodplain, do you have to have insurance?
Yes.
It would be wise, but are you saying if it's mandated, by the state or?
I'm just saying, do you have to have insurance?
It would be wise, but you don't have to.
Okay. Let's take the floodplain out of it. Do you have to have insurance on a house?
Yes.
If I buy it cash, I do not.
There you go. That's the answer I'm looking for, folks. You do not have to have insurance on real property. You be very careful on the test. They will ask you questions like that, and your brain wants to say yes because it'd be stupid not to. But folks, if you own your house outright, your stupid self cannot have insurance on it. You sure can. And there are some floodplain areas where you're not required to have insurance either. There is no requirement to have regular insurance or flood insurance if you own the house outright. But as Dora said, if you have a loan on the property, the bank cares what happens to your property. They are going to require you to have homeowners insurance, just a standard policy. And if any of the property is located in a federally designated floodplain, they are probably going to require flood insurance as well. And they're going to look at the FEMA maps. But be very careful on test questions. If the question is, do you have to have insurance? No. But if you financed it, yeah. Do understand too that your standard homeowner's insurance policy does not cover floods. And when I say floods, I mean the rivers are arising or the ocean is a coming in. That's what I mean by floods. If your toilet backs up and floods through your house, that's covered in your homeowner's insurance. But exterior water coming into your house is not covered in a standard homeowner's insurance policy. It is a separate policy, or at least what we call a rider to your policy, which is an attachment. We'll talk a little bit about more about that in the insurance section. So there are maps. You just pull them up, type in an address, and it'll say, yep, nope. Also, do understand, too, that when you look at the maps, it'll talk about what's called a 100-year floodplain. A lot of people have this misconception that it's like, oh, it only floods once every 100 years. No. 100-year floodplain means it has a 1% chance of flooding every year. Not it will only flood. Folks, there's no way to tell that, right? There's no way that you can like magic crystal ball or, it's only going to flood once every 100 years. No. It's not what it means. We'll talk more about that in a later section. Last couple just real quick little tidbits. We already talked about this, having public road access. We talked about this with easements, right? Can't be landlocked, so you have to have access to the public right-of-way, public roads. Whether a street is public or private would be a material fact that we'd have to disclose for obvious reasons. Nothing too crazy there. Another quick little mention, and I kind of talked a little bit about, riparian buffers and that the variance example, but when we're dealing with things like wetlands or areas more susceptible to, water, marshes, creeks, there is a lot of different regulations for those on what you can and can't do because they do not want to disrupt certain flows of water or the way that things happen. And so that's where, and we'll talk more about this later too, like the coast has CAMA in North Carolina, the Coastal Area Management Act. There are different, zoning regulations and designations for, homes along rivers and river basins. Just be aware of that in general. There's nothing too specific on this to care about. What time is it? Good. So let's wrap up this section and we're going to flip back to where we started, okay? I explained the difference between private and public land use controls. Now let me just recap before I switch the slide. When I say public, you should think what?
Police.
Police and?
Government.
The government. The government. There you go. Public is the government and the use of police power, all right? When I say private, you should think what?
HOA or your neighbor.
Yeah, the individual private property owners imposing restrictions and going after each other. So one or few, a neighborhood, a couple lots, a lot, all of these are private land use controls. We keep using the HOA and the subdivision restrictive covenants as an example, but folks, understand when we talked about appurtenances and encumbrances and estates, you can put whatever rule you want on your property, okay? In my house right now, my house is bound by restrictive covenants and is bound by public land use controls as well, the zoning. But as the owner of the house, there is nothing stopping me from recording a specific document that states that my house always has to have a hot pink door. I could do that today, as long as it didn't contradict any of the other rules on my house. I am the owner. I have put a private land use control on my property. It is an appurtenance. It is an encumbrance. When the next person buys my house, what do they have to have? A hot pink door. That's exactly right. Have I limited the value of my property? Probably, because some people may not want hot pink doors. At the very least, I've limited the use of it and the desirability of it. There is nothing stopping you from doing this. Yet again, you don't have to understand why people do it. You just have to understand that people do it. I had a student in one of my post-licensing classes that she asked me a question after one of the class. She's like, Seth, can I ask you a question? I said, sure, go ahead. She's like, my husband and I are looking at land that we want to build on. Well, we keep finding it with all these restrictive covenants. And he just doesn't understand, or not restrictive covenants, but I'll call it a deed restriction. Hey, John, are you meaning to talk to me?
Oh, no.
Okay, I just want to make sure. She basically said, well, my husband doesn't understand. How is it that we could own it, but we can't do what we want with it? I said, because when you're an owner, you get to say what happens to your property, to the extent that the previous owner had those rights. And so when the previous owner states it and then sells it, those rules are still in place. So you may not like it, you may not think it makes sense, but that's kind of the point of owning property. You can do whatever you want within the scope of public and private land use controls. I had another student one time ask me if they could put their property into some type of special conservation where it could never be turned into a commercial development. And I said, yeah, sure you can. But you're severely limiting the potential value down the road. Now, if you don't care, you do you, boo-boo. But private land use controls, anybody who owns property as a private property owner can put a rule on it. And that rule, unless removed, would stay in place for the next owner. It would be appurtenant. It would be binding to all subsequent owners. Folks, if you don't want a house with a pink door, are you going to buy my property that requires you to have a pink door? No. And if you want a place where you can have chickens and you don't want anybody telling you you can't have chickens, what do? There you go. You're all mouthing it. Don't buy the house that says you can't have chickens. Go buy an unrestricted lot in an area where the zoning says chickens are okay. You may not like it, but it sucks to suck, Chuck. So restrictive covenants can be for anything that's not illegal. You cannot do anything discriminatory or anything that violates other laws. Now, there are restrictive covenants that exist that are in violation of laws, but they predate those laws, and so now we just ignore them. Let me give you an example, folks. We all know the history of America. There are subdivisions that still exist that have restrictive covenants recorded that say no people of color. Well, that is a huge violation of many laws now, but at the time they recorded, it wasn't. And so they were ignored. You cannot enforce laws that now are considered illegal or restrictive covenants that are now considered illegal by law. And you could not write any new ones today. You could not have a subdivision that says no Christians. You could not have a subdivision that says no, people from Ecuador. You couldn't do that. That would all be very discriminatory and in violation of fair housing laws. But you can quite literally put any rule on your property that does not constitute an illegality. So if you want to say that it can only be used as a horse farm forever and ever, amen, you can do that. If you want to say that nobody can put a manufactured home, if you want to say that it has to be this, that, the other, it doesn't matter, you can do it. But every time you do these rules, you very much restrict your sellability, your value, and your desirability. But you can do it. What you got, Jacob?
So, Seth, let's say that I wanted your house with a pink door, or whatever, or say, you got that house. Okay, no, let me make this simple. So say, right, pink door, I end up buying that house from you. I really don't want a pink door. At any point in time, can I go to you and ask you, even after the property is purchased and is now my property, can I say, hey, Seth, this is stupid. Can you please take care of this and get this removed so that I can have a blue door?
Sure you can.
And if say you were deceased, would I have that ability anymore if I were to go to, say, one of your children? Or is that just no longer an option? Is it just always a pink door forever and always?
So that is a fantastic question. And so here's the answer, okay? It depends. In my life, if you come back to me and you say, Seth, I want you to remove this, I could. We could go down as the person who imposed that restriction. We could hire an attorney, we could draft a document, and we could say this is no longer a deed restriction on the property. We could. In regard to my heirs and assigns, yet again, potentially you could. It gets a little more iffy because, of course, I'm gone, and so a little more loopholes. But here's the thing you have to understand. If that's not the case, if you can't remove it per se, the only person who probably would have cared to enforce that rule is me. If I'm dead, can I come after you and force you to have a pink door? No. Could my heirs and assigns potentially do it? Maybe. And that's the interesting thing about these rules, folks. There are some of these things that are silly. They've been around for so long and they're stupid, but we don't know how to get rid of them. And so I will actually tell you that there is legislation in the works right now to have a statute of limitations on these things. If there's nobody around anymore that says that it should be enforceable or to potentially enforce it, we're looking to figure out a way to expunge it. Because right now, it's a lot of loopholes, it's a lot of attorneys, it's a lot of everything. So this is not testable in any way, shape, and form. Just treat it as it's there forever for the test. but there are discussions for that exact reason. There are things that were imposed in 1820 that make no freaking sense today, and there's nobody alive to care. So why should we still be worried about it? So I'm sure it will change in the next decade, if I had to guess. But yeah, as of right now, you're required to have it. And if you don't have that pink door, you're in violation of it. But who's going to enforce it? Yeah. I'm sure my neighbors would be happy if you painted the door brown. They probably didn't want to look at the pink door either. So, private land use controls can be one or a subdivision, okay? It is imposed by private landowners. They are pertinent. They are binding. The only person who can remove them is technically the person who put those restrictions on there. Now, in regard to, I will make a kind of a distinction here, because we just used that example with me, as Jacob said. When we're dealing with restrictive covenants in a subdivision, sometimes the developer will actually outline in the restrictive covenants how you can change them. And what it'll typically state is with a 2/3 majority vote of the neighborhood. So let's say that the entire neighborhood, the restrictive covenants say that you can't have chickens. Well, if you went and had an HOA meeting and the vast majority voted to have chickens, you could hire an attorney and you could draft it with this majority vote and change your restrictive covenants if you have been given that power. If you haven't, then that's where it kind of sucks to suck Chuck again. But sometimes that's written in there that you could vote on it and you could change them with the majority. But sometimes that's not put in there, and then we're like, well, what do we do? Yeah. This is where I told you at the beginning of this section, you as the neighboring property, you in a subdivision where we're all bound by the same rules, we can force these rules on each other by way of a court injunction. We do not have to prove direct harm. It doesn't have to be the freaking roosters wake me up every morning. It's just they're breaking the rule. I want you to force them to follow the rule. And because these rules are in writing and they're recorded, you can take them to court. So this is, that subdivision or the surviving person or whoever it may be, because these are private, these can go to court over. Yeah, Karen can do it. That's right. She ain't got nothing better to do. You just give her time. All right, she'll do it. Now, yet again, this also comes into play with material facts and real estate brokers. Folks, if I had a client who was desperately in need of a home, they needed to be able to have their chickens. I have an obligation to help them discover these restrictive covenants or deed restrictions that would or would not allow them to have chickens. Now understand though that while I should help guide them, help them find them, we cannot interpret anything from a legal point of view. No unauthorized practice of law. What I like to say is stay in your lane, bro. I'm a real estate professional. I'm not a real estate attorney. And so if there's any confusion or ambiguities within the restrictive covenants, you're not sure what they mean, get an attorney to help you interpret them. But by the way, the verbiage for no chickens typically says no livestock, poultry, or, something like that. That's very obvious, okay? Poultry is a chicken. Actually, it's a lot of birds, but chicken falls into poultry. Delicious, delicious poultry. So just going hand in hand with this, real estate brokers, we want to make sure that we don't leave out anything. Making claims that aren't true would get us in trouble. So if you say something, oh yeah, you can definitely have chickens here, and you didn't verify that, it's going to get you in trouble. If you don't search it whenever you knew that it was important to them, it's going to get you in trouble. So we should be able to recognize what we call red flag situations where there may be something that prevents us from doing prevents our clients from doing what their intended use is, whatever that may be. Whether it be, chickens, the ability to put in a pool, having livestock, having a horse, being able to operate a home business, being able to utilize it as an Airbnb or anything of that nature. This is just supplemental notes here. Making sure that we're checking these things, talking to our clients, nothing crazy. Just a couple more. Recognize signs of... Now, I'm going to talk about this word patent, however you want to pronounce it. I'll tell you what it means. If you're in the United States, we say it like a patent. If you're in Britain, we say it as patent. Doesn't really matter how you pronounce it, though. But what it means is obvious. Okay? When we talk about material facts, we break it into two categories. Patent versus latent. And patent things are things that we could figure out that should be able to be discovered. Latent are things that we probably can't figure out that's outside of the scope of our wheelhouse. So recognizing patent signs of flooding on a property, standing water in the crawl space, water damage, erosion, silt in places that shouldn't be, looking at the flood maps, is it in a floodplain? Looking at, major changes to highways, rezoning, construction, commercialization, all of these things could be potentially important to our clients, and we would have an obligation to help them discover these items. So to wrap up this section, let me give you a couple little application questions here. All right. Here is one of those Boolean style questions. The government regulates all of the following except. Remember, Boolean means each one of these answers has one of two values. It's either true or false. Because this is an except, you're looking for the one that is what? False. So a couple of you have answered it. Take a second. So remember what this Boolean allows you to do. You either know the answer or don't know the answer. Either way, you might be able to get to it because you may know what it's not. And so the government regulates all of the following except. So three of these things it regulates, one it doesn't, and that's the outlier. That's the one thing that's not like the other. Creation of subdivisions, yep, it regulates that. Building codes, yep, that's a public land use control. Subdivision regulations, technically A and C are the same. So by default, you knew that that one was also true. So restrictive covenants, also called protective covenants, are a private land use control. The government does not regulate those. That is imposed by private landowner to private landowner, or the private landowner to future landowner. Let me give you another one here. Steve converted his family's old estate home into a quadruplex in 2010, even though the area has been zoned single-family residential prior to that time. If he sells the property, will the new owner be able to legally rent the 4 units individually? Jacob, that was a panic answer. It's just because I wasn't making any faces. Folks, the answer is no because of the timing. So it has been zoned single-family residential prior to that time, meaning a quadruplex is not allowed. It wasn't allowed when he did it. It was already zoned a single-family residential And so you cannot just create a quadruplex. That is part of zoning ordinances. And so when he started operating as a quadruplex, he was doing an illegal non-conforming use. When he goes to sell it, it will still be an illegal non-conforming use. The legal non-conforming use only exists when the zoning changes around and you were legally in compliance before they change the zoning.
Okay, so my question is, because a quadruplex, it says that it's zoned for a single family. It's zoned for a single family home, but he makes it a quadruplex, right? Which it said whenever we were going over everything, it said that it is all determined upon your intent to sell. So if he did that for the intent for himself,
No. There's nothing about intent to sell. What are you talking about?
I could have sworn there was something about that. Never mind.
No. So with a legal non-conforming use, there are sometimes restrictions on selling. Sometimes there's not. It depends on the municipality. So like if I am grandfathered in, I could potentially sell it to you as long as you operated it the same if the municipality gave me permission. But this was just an outright illegal use. And then when he goes to sell it, it will still be an illegal use.
Okay. That makes sense. I guess I misunderstood something that was earlier on.
No worries. How about this one? True or false, the protective covenants of a neighborhood will override the less restrictive zoning laws. True. The more strict one will prevail. Oops, went too far. I gave you that example with my property. How about this one? True or false, the act of the government taking your land to build a new school is called eminent domain.
That's true.
That's false. The right of the government to take your land is called eminent domain. The act of actually taking it is called condemnation. Semantics matter. You've got to answer the question quite literally. The right of the government to take your land for the greater good is called eminent domain. The act of actually taking is called condemnation. I told you, Jacob, there's a big portion of this that is just test taking. Don't overthink it, but you've got to calibrate your brains to look at these questions in a certain light. And so even as an instructor, sometimes I'll read the questions and my first instinct will be the wrong answer. And I'm like, wait a second. And then you have to read back through it and realize that there's a little more to the question than you realize. And that's where the other test taking strategy is. Read the question in its entirety. Make sure you understand what the exact question is. Read all the answer choices, then reread the question before you answer it. If you don't do that, you're more likely to make mistakes. Now that wraps up this first fun-filled section. And I'll leave these up for a little bit. We talked about all these: police power, dealing with public land use controls because it's governmental. Variance is a minor exception to a ordinance or rule. Non-conforming use is the generalization when you don't meet the current zoning. Could be legal, could be illegal depending. Spot zoning is a very small area that's been rezoned, could constitute illegalities. If it's not for the greater good, can be overturned by a court. Interstate Land Sale Full Disclosure Act is for 25 or more lots being marketed across state lines. Requires certain disclosures. What you got, Justin?
So when you were telling us about the older man whose house got taken, I think, in care, was that the act or was that the right?
It was both. One is the precursor to the other. The government had the right to take the front portion of that man's yard under the right of eminent domain. And when they took that front portion for Cary Parkway, that was called condemnation. They took that front portion and turned it into Cary Parkway. So it's both. One is the precursor to the other. But you've got to understand the specifics, right? The right, eminent domain, the act, condemnation. When they actually take it, it's when they condemn it, condemnation. Yeah, I mean, there's a million pieces of vocab in the book. And of course, there's a glossary in the book. There's a definition in the book. There's some flashcards in the program. I've got some more vocab lists somewhere that I can share with you. I actually have like a vocab list that I'll give you. Full disclosure, I have a list from a previous student who was just a crazy studier, and she wrote out all of the words that she thought were important little flashcards. It's just a PDF. And she shared it with me to share to future classes. It's more time than I have to put that together, but I'm happy to share it with you all to just kind of have like a summation of these different places where she put it together. Now, I've not vetted all of them because I'm a very busy man, but I'm more than happy to share it with you. So, but she was a pretty sharp student and she did pass the class. So if that makes you feel any better. Yeah, I'll put it in the group me. Folks, I owe you another break. So I'll leave this up for a minute, and then before we start back, we'll be in a new set of slides, and I'll get you a copy of those slides in the very near future as well. And then this next grouping is 6 through 10. And understand that these slides are flowing with the syllabus, the old syllabus, not the new syllabus. And so 6 is going to be environmental, 7 is going to be agencies, 8 is agency contracts, 9 is basic contract law, and then 10 is specific NC contract. So that's what we're getting into, all of which are extremely testable sections. Except for environmental. Environmental is a wham bam, thank you ma'am kind of section. So, you ready to do the darn thing? Let's do the darn thing. So here is the deal with environmental. I always like to give you just kind of a quick rundown of what we're dealing with in the sections, because I find it helps you understand if I kind of preface it with the most important pieces. When we're dealing with real estate, there are, of course, some environmental concerns that come into play from both a commercial, residential, generalization, land point of view. Now, there are some things that are way more testable than others. Now, before I go any deeper in this, I'm going to remind you of a material fact. I've already said this terminology a lot, and we haven't really gotten to the section where we dive deep into it. But a material fact, as I have already articulated, is any fact that, if known, could change the outlook of a party in completing a transaction. And so let's just equate this to environmental. If I told you that there was an environmental contamination on the property, that would change the outlook of somebody potentially wanting to buy the property. So maybe not to that extent, but there are plenty of environmental concerns that could change the outlook of somebody. So this whole section, while it's a small one, there are a couple things that are very testable in this section, but then the rest of them are generalized, very small little things. Yeah, there you go. Jacob says like a Breaking Bad basement. That is absolutely a discussion we're going to have in this section. Something I'm going to bring up, and it's going to make a recurrence in the next section. So let me just name some of these environmental issues, okay? When we're dealing with a house in general, we could have contaminated well water from radon, nearby landfills, underground petroleum, underground storage tanks that leak that petroleum or some other type of thing into the ground. Radon, which we're going to talk about, is a colorless, odorless, tasteless gas. It's carcinogenic. It can cause cancer. Carbon monoxide, which is the byproduct of combustion. It's what comes out of your car exhaust. It is called the silent killer. It is very dangerous. This electromagnetic radiation, being too close to, power lines and the transformers and things like that. PCB stands for why can't I think of it? It's a funny word.
Polybutylene.
No, not polybutylene. What is PCBs? I can't think of the word right now. It's a big word. PCBs.
polychlorinated biphenyls,
Something like that. Yeah.
biphenyls.
Yeah, it's something like that. So we just call them PCBs for short, because it is just a crazy word. Polychlorinated. Yeah, biphenyls. Polychlorinated biphenyls. Very crazy word, but that's not the very testable one. Mold we're going to talk about. Folks, hands down the most testable. Radon, lead-based paint, asbestos. Okay? Hands down. Radon, lead-based paint, asbestos. So as I'm talking about these different environmental hazards, any given property could have a numerous amount of different possible environmental issues. And so these are discussions we have to have as real estate brokers, because most of these would constitute material facts, not all. And so, asbestos, lead-based paint, radon, urea formaldehyde, carbon monoxide, all these things we just mentioned are all potentially material facts and environmental issues that could occur in real estate. So let's just go ahead and rip the Band-Aid and talk about the most testable one, okay? And that is lead-based paint. Now, lead-based paint, we all kind of figured out at this point that lead is not great. But lead is also not dangerous to just be around. If there is a big old hunk of lead beside you and you were just standing there next to it for 10,000 years, it would cause you no issues. Lead is not dangerous in that regard. Lead is dangerous to be ingested. If you breathe it in, if you get stabbed with a lead pencil, if you drink something from like a lead-lined pipe, this can cause lead poisoning. Now, of course, you would have to have very high levels of lead to get lead poisoning, to get actually, to the point of being, sick or having some other type of issue. Now, folks, some of you look like you're still writing down these notes. I'll leave this up for one more second and I'll switch to lead. Here's the deal. When we're talking about this, I have to inform you of something. Science has not always been so sciencey. That's just the best way I can put it. I'm going to say that again. Science has not always been so sciencey. Did you know that once upon a time, there was some fool who made radioactive water and sold it as a curative tonic? Did you know that was a thing? And people would, buy radioactive water and drink it as a curative tonic back in the day. And there was one such man whose jaw fell off because he drank this radioactive water and it just killed and necroted all of his tissues. And he ultimately died, but he continued to drink it after his jaw fell off because it couldn't have been the radioactive water. There's also a documentary that exists out there about a watch company and the women who painted the watches that they glowed in the dark. And so they were one of the earlier versions of these, and it was a very toxic chemical. There you go, Misty, the Radon girls. Very toxic chemical that they utilized, and so they all died horrible, cancerous deaths. And so science has not always been so sciencey. So lead, folks, was utilized in a couple different things back in the day before we knew just how bad it was. There is a reason that when you go to your gas station and you fill up, it is called unleaded gasoline. Once upon a time, a scientist developed a type of gas that had lead in it because it was good on combustion and made for good fuel economy, and it was cheaper than a lot of the other things they were combining with it. There's a whole study about the negative outcomes of leaded gasoline, and so leaded gasoline is actually outlawed in almost every country. Not every country, but just about. But I say all that to say why this is important from a real estate point of view. Back in the day, lead was utilized in paint as a drying agent and a pigment agent. It made the colors more vibrant and it made the paint dry faster. So they started incorporating lead into paint. This is before we knew just how bad lead was. And so when we started to realize this, they outlawed the use of paint in residential properties in 1978. Now here is a very important testable piece. It was outlawed in 1978. And so there is what we call the Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act. This is a national concept. A national concept. And so there is a required disclosure to be given to consumers if a house was, now listen to this, The word is just as important as the year. If the house was built prior to 1978, folks, that means 77 and before. If a house was built in 78, a disclosure is not required. Be very careful on the test. The word prior is as equally as important as the year 1978. And so, yet again, having lead-based paint in your house isn't necessarily a problem for most of us because the paint is on the walls and we are not. Here's the issue. While you and I may not wander around licking our walls and chewing on baseboards, there is a certain demographic of society that might. Your kids. There you go. And so it is especially dangerous for children for obvious reasons. They're smaller, they're more susceptible to lead poisoning, and it can cause major nervous system and brain development issues. So they can cause, same thing with pregnant women. If a pregnant woman gets exposed to it, it can cause birth defects, and a developing child can have, all kinds of issues. So for the general public, lead in and of itself is not dangerous, but if there's this potential to ingest it, for it to, come into contact with, anything in your lungs, your, food or whatever, it's a problem. Now, do understand that there's a couple very important things that I'm going to continue to build on here. The disclosure is required for properties built prior to 1978. Now, understand that disclosure didn't come into play until 1992. That was the Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act was filed in 1992. Because what they did is they said, okay, well, lead's bad, so we'll stop using it in residential in 78. But then they realized that a lot of people were owning these homes and they didn't realize that they may have lead in their homes. And so they said, okay, well, we need to let people know that there might be lead in their homes. Understand that there is no requirement to have the house tested. And there is no guarantee that your house does or does not have lead. It's just a required disclosure where they have to state whether they do know about lead presence or they don't know. So if a seller does know, they have to tell you. If they've had their house tested and they know there's lead, they have to tell you there's lead in the house. If they don't know, there's no obligation for anybody to test. And they would just say, I don't know. And that's enough. Now, they do have to give you a 10-day period to investigate the property and have a test if you want it. Now, here's where I'm going to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole because I told you about material facts. Well, let me introduce another North Carolina specific concept. And I want you to understand some differentiations here. In the next section, we're going to start talking about something in North Carolina called the doctrine of caveat emptor. That is a very specific North Carolina doctrine. We may not be the only state that utilizes it. So here's a multifaceted learning lesson here. The doctrine of caveat emptor North Carolina basically states that sellers don't have to disclose things that are wrong with their property. But because this is a federal piece of legislation, this supersedes that. And so if they knew, they would be legally obligated to disclose that they had lead in their house. And so their only options are, if they know, they have to tell us, and if they don't know, they can say that. Everybody following with me here? The reason why this is important is because when we get into some of the more specific North Carolina disclosures, you will find that there are certain things that sellers absolutely do not have to disclose. But every seller in every state has to disclose if they know about lead. They do not have the option of withholding that information. That would be illegal. So let me add a couple more notes here. And then I'm going to actually show you the document. I'm going to introduce you to the lead-based paint hazard addendum, as it's called in North Carolina. Every state has it. Sometimes they're called a little bit different, but it's basically a lead-based paint disclosure. I told you that the purchaser has to be given a 10-day period of time where they can choose to have the property tested if they so desire. They are not required to utilize that 10 days. They can waive that right. And please understand that this would apply to long-term residential rentals as well. If somebody was purchasing a property built prior to 1978, they would have to receive this disclosure. If somebody was renting a home built prior to 1978, they'd have to receive the same disclosures and the same everything. I'm going to pull up the list here while you look at this slide. Now understand, I'm about to pull up the document from a list of all the sample forms. You have the sample forms in your textbook program. It's kind of towards the end as like, you know, I can't remember what it's called in there, but you do have them. Here we go. So here is the lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazard addendum. Why is it redundant and says both? Well, because there is also issues with soils being contaminated by lead-based paint. As you'd imagine, if the exterior of the house had lead-based paint on it and they were ever to scrape it and repaint it, then that soil underneath could potentially be contaminated from that lead-based paint. So that's why it says it twice. The lead-based paint itself or other things being contaminated by the lead-based paints within. And so it identifies the property. And so this would be put in as an offer in North Carolina, and we're going to get into the specifics. Now, here's where I've got to give you kind of another nuance between North Carolina and the nation. When we're dealing with North Carolina, we have a very unique type of contract called a due diligence style contract. Here is a mini lesson on that. A due diligence period is a period of time that a buyer has to investigate the property to decide if they want to move forward with the purchase or not. Well, a lot of states don't have that in their contracts. And so regardless of which state you're in, you have to be given this 10-day assessment period. Now, North Carolina's document references the due diligence period because we basically say, okay, you can do your assessment during your due diligence period. But even in states that don't have a due diligence period, they'd have to be given this assessment. Now, trust me, this will make more sense when we get into the sales contracts in North Carolina section. You just have to kind of have a little faith right now because we just haven't learned that full lesson yet. And so here's where the seller makes their disclosures. Presence of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards. They either do know, and they check this box, known lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards are present in the house, and we'll tell you about them. Or seller has no knowledge of any lead-based paint. And then seller has records, and here you go, we're going to provide them. Or seller has no records or reports to provide. So it's either, yes, there is an issue, here's some reports, or I have no idea, and I have no reports. And that's okay. Testing is not required. Be very careful on that on the test. There's no requirement for testing on anybody's part. Buyers have to be given the right to test if they want to. So from a buyer point of view and an agency point of view, there is obligations of both agents. Now here's where I'm starting to use that word agent, and so I'm not going to do a deep dive, but the person representing the interest of the seller has to tell the seller of their obligations to answer this. The person who is working with the buyer, I'm just going to say working with, and that'll make more sense later, has to inform them about the potential for lead-based paint hazards and provide an EPA pamphlet. EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency. It's called Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. It's basically an informational pamphlet on lead-based paint. And then they would either accept the right to investigate or not, and then they acknowledge the disclosure right here. And we have agents on both sides signing this. Listing agent, selling agent. Now, I want you to take note of this word selling because I'm going to explain it when we get into the agency section. It may not be tonight the way we're going. It might. We'll see. But this is the lead-based paint hazard addendum. It is the one required under the Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act of 1992, and it is required on homes built prior to what year?
1978.
1978.
Prior to 1978.
There you go. So be aware, folks, if you see a test question that says, which of the following would a property built in 1978 be subject to, the lead-based paint will be an option. And you've got to know that that's not it. It's trying to trick you. If it was built in 78, the disclosure is not required. If it was built in 77, it is. Prior to 78. That is hands down the most testable environmental thing on the pre-licensing exam. I promise it is. Hands down. Now I want to point out one thing, okay? And I'm gonna give you a little backstory here. Do understand that it would be a violation of license law or commission rule for me to attempt to know anything that was on the state licensing exam unless they gave me permission to know it, and they haven't. As such, it would be illegal for you folks to share information about the state licensing exam. So I can't stress that enough. Even if you stay friends and one of you goes to take the test, do not try to share in any kind of Facebook groups what you saw on the test, because there have been people who have been barred from getting their license for doing that before they even got their license. It's illegal to share the information of what's on the test. That being said, there are times that students come back to us as instructors and they'll say something like, Seth, it was the craziest thing. This was on my test and I didn't understand because this was the answer. Here's what you have to understand about when students do that. 99% of the time they misremember it and they're relaying something and they thought they got it right, but in fact they got it wrong, or they're combining two questions, because your brain is mush by the time you get done with that test. I promise it is. Here's the reason I'm telling you this. Once upon a time, I'm sure that it was relayed back to an instructor in some way, shape, or form that the next thing that I'm about to tell you was on their test. And it may or may not be true. And I don't know this, but I'm going to tell it to you just in case it is. Because lead-based paint is not dangerous in and of itself, in fact, it's really only dangerous if you ingest it, paint in good condition is not dangerous. Here's the point. You may see the word friable utilized for lead-based paint, and you may see the word encapsulation used for lead-based paint. But I promise you that the most common and most appropriate use of the term friable and encapsulation is asbestos. If you have paint that is flaking off the wall and you were to repaint it so now it was in good repair, not flaking, that would be an example of potentially flaking off where it could go into the air and then encapsulating it so it's not free anymore. Unfortunately, though, I don't know that that's the appropriate use of those terminologies, but that is the words we use when we're talking about asbestos. So you see what I'm saying? I feel like it made it into a bunch of our slides as instructors because students were like, no, they were talking about lead-based paint and friable and asbestos, or, encapsulation. So here's asbestos. Asbestos, you've heard before, it's a mineral, and it was utilized for certain reasons as well before they realized how dangerous it was. This mineral was great for being fire resistant and had great insulating purposes. So people started using it because it helped store heat and prevented buildings from burning faster. Sounds like a great thing in construction. Yet again, though, they didn't realize just how dangerous it was. Now, yet again, just like lead, it's not dangerous to be right beside something that is asbestos. Asbestos is dangerous, here's that word, when it becomes friable. Friable means starts to disintegrate or break down and the particulates get into the air. Then you inhale them, and they can cause major issues like lung cancer or otherwise. And so understand that it is possible to remove asbestos insulation, asbestos tiles, asbestos anything. But folks, I want you to think about this. If this is dangerous when it gets into the air, Do you think it's a good idea to send somebody into a house full of asbestos with a sledgehammer and start knocking it down? What's going to happen? It's going to fly into the air. And so while removal is possible, it is extremely costly because you have to have certified people who are authorized to work with asbestos, and they have to spray down the entire area with water. They have to fully saturate it to prevent the dust from flying off, which just makes it even harder to work with. And so for that reason, removal of asbestos is not the preferred method of dealing with it. The preferred method of remediation or dealing with it is, here's that other word, encapsulation. You basically see, and I'll switch back to the other slide in a second. Nobody panic. I just wanted you to see the word. Encapsulation is the preferred method of dealing with asbestos because if you encapsulate it behind an epoxy, a resin, a rubber, a sealant, and it can no longer become friable, it's not dangerous to you anymore. Kirsten says popcorn ceilings, nightmare. Yes. Now, of course, newer popcorn ceilings, it was around the same time that they outlawed lead-based paint, that they outlawed asbestos. It was around 78. Folks, here's the interesting thing. Did you know they never outlawed it in commercial buildings either? It was only outlawed in residential. It's still completely legal for schools and places of work to have asbestos and lead-based paint. I'm not saying they're using it, but it's still, yeah, I know, Adriana, it's still completely legal. In fact, I think NC State is dealing with some litigation right now over some testing in one of their big buildings because, people in a certain area developed cancer. And I don't remember if it's from asbestos or what, but there was something in a building at NC State. Yeah, a bunch of people got cancer from it. It's a weird thing. I heard it on the radio the other day. So this is where I told you, you're more likely to, I just went back one. I didn't go forward. I went back one just in case any of you were still looking at this. Asbestos is a mineral. It is dangerous when it becomes friable, which is where the particulates get into the air. So that's what I'm telling you. Friable and encapsulation are going to be more than likely only testable on asbestos. But if you see it on the test and it's the best answer for lead-based paint, in theory, it could be true. Because if you encapsulate lead-based paint behind newer paint, it's less dangerous. You see the distinction and the clarification I was trying to make now? It's just a very similar concept because they're both environmental. But we've always been teaching that asbestos is friable, or dangerous when it becomes friable, and that encapsulation is the preferred method of remediation. So yet again, asbestos and lead-based paint, two of the most testable, hands down. Josh says Congress finished a renovation of the U.S. Capitol water pipe system in 2020 because they still had lead-based pipes. Notice there was limited fountains before. Oh, wow. Now, it's funny, Josh. I watched a thing, I think it was probably just scrolling through, Facebook. It was a reel on, the Greek Empire or something and how their pipes were all made out of lead. But nobody got sick because it wasn't stagnant water. If the water is stagnant, it will absorb the lead and become dangerous. But because the water is always flowing, it never... So in theory, even lead-based pipes can only cause so much damage under certain circumstances. But if it sits there and becomes stagnant, it will absorb it and it'll be very dangerous.
Didn't way back when they also used to use lead to seal cans?
Yeah, remember when I said that sciencey used to be not so sciencey? Yeah. Just like seatbelts were invented in 1970 or something like that. I mean, it's just crazy. And then you see play equipment from the 1960s and it's just death traps. It's 30 feet in the air, just kids climbing up just to fall and break their necks. I mean, it's just it's a wonder that we have as many generations as we do. I just assumed everybody would die back in the day from some of these death traps we had. Let's talk about the other one that is probably the most testable. And because I said there's really three. I'm not going to say that you're not going to see the others, but I just can guarantee you're going to see lead, you're going to see asbestos, and you're going to see radon. Did you just look it up, Tim? Was that what I was talking about? The PCBs and the, yep, there you go. Good on you. Yeah, I knew I just saw something about it. So PCBs, that word that I couldn't pronounce at the beginning, the polychlorophenols or whatever. So we just call them PCBs for short. The problem for me with PCBs is I go down to Panama City Beach every year, a couple times a year, and so I always call it PCB. And so now I forgot. I'm like, oh yeah, that's also the name for environmental issue, PCBs. Let's talk about radon, folks. Radon is a colorless, odorless, tasteless gas. Let me tell you what that means, folks. Listen, if you hop in the car right now and you head to Florida yourself to have a fun time at the beach, and along the way, you and whoever you go with stop and get a snacky, and you just happen to stop at Taco Bell, and you're cruising along, and they decide to hotbox you, you are going to smell it, aren't you? And if you don't know what a hot box is, it is where they lock the windows and they let one rip in the car. You're welcome. Okay, there's your Urban Dictionary definition for the day. Let me tell you the reason that I'm giving you this vivid picture, okay, of your friend or spouse or whoever ripping one in the car. Folks, that's a gas. That one has a smell, but regardless, how do you fix it if you want to have a breath of relief and not die in the car? What do you do?
Roll down the window.
Roll down the window. That is the reason I just made that comparison, because on the test, you will need to know that ventilation is the way that you deal with this radon issue. Air it out. Just like you would that. Now, colorless, odorless, tasteless, you will never know that there is an issue unless you do a test. It requires very specific testing where they basically put a machine in your house that monitors your living conditions as they are for typically 48 hours. And so there are different levels, and they are rated on what's called picocuries per liter. If it is 4 picocuries per liter or higher, it is considered a material fact in North Carolina, and it is considered hazardous by the Environmental Protection Agency. Doesn't mean that less than 4 is good, but 4 is the level where it's considered more hazardous to your health. Yet again, this is one of the leading causes of lung cancer. And so what happens is this occurs from naturally occurring radioactive materials in the soil that decompose and break down, and the byproduct is this radon gas. And so let's say that it's in the soil, it builds up, it comes through, it gets in your foundation, it builds up in your foundation, and then it will seep up through your subfloor and into your living space, and then you are breathing it in. Well, how do you fix that? Look right there. That is a vent. There's what we call passive systems, and there's what we call active systems. This is an active system because that's a blower motor, that's a fan. And so that will actually spin and pull the air out from under and then kicks it up into the atmosphere, and so it's not going into your house. A passive system is just creating additional vents for it to escape. Justin, you have a radon remediation system? Yep, the fan that just kicks it. And folks, understand that radon, while it's not like the highest levels in North Carolina that you've ever seen, there is the potential for it to be in just about every area of North Carolina. Let me show you this. The darker the purple, the more likely you are to have an issue. So it's really non-existent between Fayetteville to Wilmington, but you could have an issue anywhere else. And there could be 2 houses side by side in any given area where one has an issue and one doesn't. Sometimes there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's, of course, more concentrated in more mountainous areas. When you go to like the mountain areas of North Carolina up to the mountains of West Virginia, it's way more prevalent. So colorless, odorless, tasteless gas, considered a material fact at 4 picocuries per liter or higher. And the way that you remediate a radon issue is ventilation, passive and or active systems. the rest of them, with the exception of one other ones, are just going to be like flashcard level, okay? I'm just going to breeze through it. Here's the next one. Formaldehyde. Folks, you've heard the term formaldehyde before. It is an embalming agent. If you have ever dissected a pig or a frog in biology class, it is in formaldehyde to prevent it from decaying. Oh, the memories. And it smells horrible. Formaldehyde is used in insulation and it's used in boards. There is what we call urea formaldehyde insulation. And then, of course, it is used as a preserving agent for treated lumber. Folks, arsenic used to be used as a treating agent for treated lumber. But they took that out. And so formaldehyde, you're not going to walk around and eat your fence or your wood that is pressure treated. But this formaldehyde can cause irritation to people with allergies and sensitivity. And there are some studies that suggest that it can cause cancer, but those studies have all been done in animals. There's never been any studies on humans. So just know that it is used in some pressure-treated boards and typically not super consequential. If anybody has any allergies or issues, eye irritation, the typical remedy for it, because you can't really remove a lot of these boards, is to get a HEPA filtration system. Air purifiers. Helps get some of the components out of the air. Like I said, not extremely testable, and I'll tell you this. As I was skimming through the new syllabus, I didn't even see this term on there on the environmental section. I'm not going to not teach it to you, though, just because who knows, but I didn't see it on the new syllabus. Who knows? And as I said, yeah, if you could remove it, go ahead, but typically it's not cost effective, not even possible. And so air purifiers help. Now let's talk about the next one, okay? The next one is mold. Now before I switch to the slides, let me just tell you, we do not like that word in real estate. We don't. We prefer the term microbial growth when you get your license, because not all microbial growth is mold, and even then, not all mold is bad. Folks, what do we always say? Well, blue cheese is mold, and right, we like blue cheese, and right? There's always types of mold that are acceptable. And so please understand that mold in and of itself is not necessarily a material fact. And it's not necessarily toxic mold either. But yes, in high concentrations, and when it is toxic mold, it is considered a material fact. So in just about every home in North Carolina that has not been treated or doesn't have, it's not, sealed, you can find some type of microbial growth in crawl spaces. Why? Because it's dark. It's always a little damp, and there's wood, which are the perfect cacophony of things for microbial growth to exist. So mold typically can cause some respiratory issues, some other health hazards, especially to those with asthma and sensitivity. Then, of course, toxic mold can make you very sick if not treated or handled appropriately. But not all mold is a material fact, and not all mold is bad mold or toxic. The second notice says can make it difficult to obtain homeowners insurance. That is because it is very hard to treat it cost effectively because it spreads so much. So if you don't catch it early and you don't catch it right, it can make it into all the walls. And as you'd imagine, tearing a house down to the studs to treat it for mold is not cost effective for an insurance company. And so if they know about it, they may have an issue. So here's another one. Underground storage tanks. Let me give you some insight here. Just like science didn't used to be so sciencey, technology has come a long way. So back in the day, folks, think about this. If you've ever seen Little House on the Prairie, AC is yet again a relatively newer commodity. All right. Once upon a time, people didn't have AC. They opened a window. Or they took off some clothes, I reckon. But what they did have earlier than AC was heat. And so it was not uncommon for older homes to have some type of furnace or baseboard heat or something like that that ran off some type of petroleum or oil. And because they were using so much of it as their main source of heat, they would take tanks and they would bury them in the ground to store this oil so they were out of sight. And they would basically just refill them as they needed to service these furnaces. Well, as time went on and technology got better and heat pumps as they exist now were invented and AC was a thing and people started adding those to their houses, heat pumps would do both. They would heat, they would AC. And so these became irrelevant in most homes. Well, as opposed to emptying them out, a lot of people just abandon them. And so I want you to picture what happens to a big piece of metal full of oil in the ground when you leave it for 60, 70 years in the elements. What do you think happens?
It's gonna corrode, it's gonna dismantle itself, and it's gonna leak into nearby.
There you go. It is going to rust, it is going to corrode, it is going to come open, and it is going to leak, and that is going to cause soil and groundwater contamination if there was any oil or anything in there. And so there was a big realization that there were so many of these, and so there used to be what's called CERCLA. You may see this on the test, and I think I might have a slide for it. CERCLA, C-E-R-C-L-A. Comprehensive Environmental Reduction and Liability Cleanup Act, CERCLA. And part of CERCLA created what was called a Superfund, which is basically where the government created grant money to help people with certain contaminations and cleanups from byproducts of bad decisions over the years, like these underground storage tanks. And so you used to be able to file for a grant to get government paid assistance to help cleaning these things up, both on a residential and commercial factor. The money's dried up now. There was too many. The government said, nope, sucks to suck, Chuck. We tried to help. There was just too many of them, and we're going to go broke. And so you have to understand that the owner of a home that has a contaminated underground storage tank is probably going to be liable for the cleanup. They basically said, well, there's really no way for us to fix this, and you're not going to be able to find the original owner. And so they just basically put the burden on the individual property owner. If you own a home that has an underground storage tank and there's contamination, probably going to fall on you. Now, there are, of course, federal and state guidelines for cleanup and how this is handled. In the real world, in a perfect world, if we have one of these, what you would do is you would vacuum out the tank, empty it out completely, and then if possible, you would excavate it out, rip it up. If there's any contaminated soil, you would dig it up, and then you would backfill with clean soil, and it's considered a non-issue anymore. But they used to build them under the houses, right next to the houses, right next to the foundation. So sometimes you can't remove them, and that would, of course, result in what's called and this is not testable, this is just me letting you know. It's called it's a title defect. It's called a notice of residual petroleum. So what you need to know is, from a liability point of view, the owner of a property that has an underground storage tank is responsible for it potentially. If you're a real estate broker assisting a buyer in purchasing an older home, you would want to suggest that maybe we inspect to find if there's an underground storage tank and test and see if there's any contamination. So underground storage tanks are absolutely a material fact. North Carolina, we put out an update, and I think it might actually be on the syllabus, and it's called the 4 S's. The 4 S's were special categories of disclosures that we needed to make as real estate brokers because of the high likelihood of them being not disclosed appropriately. So the 4 S's, you can kind of, you haven't heard all of them yet, but you've heard most of them. This one's a stretch. Underground storage tanks is one of the S's. Streets, whether they're public or private, is one of the S's. Septic tanks, meaning being advertised for the appropriate bedrooms permitted. The last one you haven't heard is square footage. And we're going to get to that one. We talked about square footage and calculations when we talked about, the area of the lot. But square footage is not a material fact, but it has to be accurate when we disclose it as real estate licensees. So we'll talk more about that one down the road. So this is just making sure that we all understand that it is a material fact. As I said, would want to suggest and encourage our buyers to have investigations and inspections on these things to determine if there's any contamination, so that way you could potentially ask the seller to remediate it, because if you buy it, you may be liable for it.
Seth,
Yep.
I'm gonna have to get off of here. My sister had a house fire today, and I've got their family here, and it's time to get all these kids in pallets on the spare rooms. So I'm clocking out at 9:30. Okay.
Okay. Sounds good. Remember, Zoom's tracking everything, so it's all good.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'll see you next week.
Sounds good. Have a good night.
Bye.
So here is CERCLA, and that's where I'll just kind of leave it, and we'll pick up from here. So 9 minutes left, and I'll let you just talk to me about whatever, like I normally do. But so I got the acronym wrong. CERCLA is Comprehensive Environmental Response. I said Reduction, Compensation and Liability Act. Okay, Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act. And so this just deals with, properties and contamination. It was a big thing because, yet again, we didn't really take care of stuff the way that we needed to back in the day. People didn't realize it was an issue. And so this was kind of in response to some of the contaminations on, home sites, commercial buildings, residential, and otherwise. So just a quick little thing to put your minds right for next week. We will get into agency, okay? And I'm going to be honest, agency is a doozy of a chapter. Now, the way that I teach it is kind of a unique way, and so it will move pretty fast. So we will finish up environmental. In fact, we barely have any left of environmental. And then we'll go right into agency. And so first we're going to just talk about agency and brokerage relationships, explain how agency works. And then we're going to get into agency contracts, specific documents and how they work. Then we're going to get into basic contract law. It seems contradictory, but it'll work out because we talk about contracts before we talk about how contracts work in general. But it'll all kind of come full circle. And then after that, the Section 10 is the specific North Carolina contracts. So that's kind of how it's going to flow. I would say on Monday, we will get through at least 6 and probably start 7. So we'll get through agency on Monday and maybe scratch the surface on the agency contracts. Maybe, maybe not. There is no way, though, that we will probably get much past we definitely won't get past 10. And if we do, it'll be just barely next week because it's going to be just so many things in conversation. So only up to contracts, North Carolina contracts, looking at the old syllabus and kind of the way it flows. So that being said, what do you want to talk about for the last 6 minutes?
You stated that slides can be found on Teams, right?
I'm going to put them on there.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me pull this up and show you. So like Josh, when I say like 10, I mean unit 10 in the syllabus. It doesn't really do me any good to talk about the book because the book is, there's no book that works perfectly to the syllabus. So when I say 10, I mean Unit 10 on the 2023 syllabus, which is up to North Carolina sales contracts. Who is unmuted? And is that you, Dora? Did you still have another question? No. What else? What's our last day of class, folks? What is it?
Like the 15th or 16th or something.
The 13th? I think it's the 13th. Let's see. Yeah, 13th. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Yeah, 12 more days. Yeah, we're good. Corey says, is there a test site for the exam or is it online? For our class exam, you will do it just like this. There is a certain protocol we have to go through. I will share the exam with you. There is a proctoring process. You will have to open up a link for the test. You will share your screen with me. So the only thing that you have open is your exam. You can show me your scrap paper and your dumb calculator. And then, I will sit here and I will proctor all of you folks while you take your exam. So you will not be allowed to get up. You will have to be unmuted. And, things of that nature. But yeah, you take it from the comfort of your home on your computer for the class exam. Yeah, 12 days does feel crazy. And it doesn't slow down, folks. I mean, we've still got to get through those 4 chapters that I mentioned, or sections. Financing, valuations, those are just really big doozy chapters. Some of the other ones are not so crazy, like property management, closing a sales transaction. And so, as we get closer, we'll kind of see where we need to spend more time, where we spend less time. The goal for me is to try to get us through the bulk of the material prior to that last Monday. And so then that way we can spend the Tuesday, the 12th, doing review. And then that way the 13th will be your test night. If I math that correctly, I believe that's the way I have it structured. So technically it's 11 more days of education, and then the last night is test. But we'll get through it. What you got, Adriana?
I have a question with the Raiden.
From Mortal Kombat, he was my favorite.
How do you pronounce that?
No, I'm just thinking Raiden.
Okay, so is the buyer also that he should also encourage to test for Raiden?
Yes, absolutely. Because there's an issue, there could be an issue, there's no way to know unless we do a test. It might be something we absolutely want to suggest to our buyers as an agent. Yep.
So if the buyer does not, if the buyer agent does not encourage, and then later find, the owner find out that there is Raiden, in fact. So is there any fine or?
No, we're going to talk about the licensing laws and rules more in depth very soon after the agency section. Is typically a good time to kind of bring it back into play. But for the sake of the test, I wouldn't worry too much about that. They're not going to necessarily be talking about best practices. They're going to be talking about more of like the specifics, like 4 picocuries per liter and higher is a material fact. Not so much like, oh, if you didn't recommend a radon test, you're in trouble. That's too vague and too specialized for the test. Yeah. But in the real world, could there be some liability? Maybe, depending. We would need more information.
So because any house can be subject to...
It's possible. And because it can cause such issues, it's possible. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is it that's decomposing again that causes radon?
Naturally occurring radioactive materials in the soil. Uranium, stuff like that. There's small amounts of it, that just naturally occur in the soils. It's just typically, not. You want to hear an interesting side note before I answer Josh's question? The way that radon was discovered is because back in like the 1970s, there was a guy who worked at a nuclear power plant, and they had a Geiger counter at the door to measure the radiation exposure levels to the employees as they were walking out. Well, there was a guy who kept coming into work and triggering the Geiger counter because he was coming into work radioactive, not leaving work radioactive. And so they realized that he was being exposed to this radon in his house. That's the way radon was discovered. Isn't that funny?
Neat.
Yeah, I know. The more you know. What you got, Josh?
Okay, so for easement and gross,
Mm-hmm.
we know that once we have the sale of the property, that easement is not transferable to the new owner.
Be careful, because the easement in gross cannot be transferred from the person to another person, but it is an appurtenance. And so if, Josh, I gave you the right to use my property under an easement in gross, when I sell the property, the next owner would have to allow you to keep using it.
Okay.
Yeah, your right as the person can't be transferred, but the right to use the property will transfer to the new owner, which is why it's called an encumbrance, or considered an encumbrance.
Got you. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep, there you go.
Picture of power lines. And I was like, well, what happens if they...
Yeah, and so those would be a commercial easement in gross. And so the commercial easement in gross won't die because those companies can be absorbed.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep, there you go. Folks, it is time. Listen, no class tomorrow. Y'all enjoy your Valentine's Day with your significant others, or by yourself, or your cat, or your dog. No judgment. You do you, boo-boo. If you got a question, I will answer it. I just don't want to hold anybody else hostage because I want to be respectful of your time. So y'all are free to go. I will see y'all next Monday. I will get the videos up.